Chapter 1298. Isaac's words did not seem to attract the slightest attention. A little flame flickered in her dark eyes. The sea of bones, black flags, and purple crystal clusters covered the sky like a tide. Lightning fell from the clouds and one or two flames streaked across the sky. The distant scene of the battlefield was reflected in the depths of this pair of emotionless and cold eyes. She turned around. She stretched out a pale and slender finger, holding the mercury staff in her hand, and pointed in one direction. There was no order. However, behind her, the undead lords all pressed their bony palms to their chests, and the soul fire in their chests burned fiercely. The dark nobles lowered their heads like the tide, and ripples spread from front to back. They turned around and pale flames flickered in their eye sockets. The Madara generals in the last row understood and turned around. They opened their hollow jaws and waved their white bony fists at the necromancers and undead wizard apprentices as they roared angrily. Let those cowards from Balakarivo enter the field and tell them, for the eternal rest of the dead, long live the Black Rose of Bramanto. The Black Rose will never wither. The sound of the command came one after another on the battlefield. The low-level liches and undead wizard apprentices hurriedly ran back, and some even fell to the ground on the way. But under the supervision of the undead supervisors, these unlucky fellows immediately got up on their hands and feet and ran to the few huge crystal towers behind the high platform. Groups of liches and undead wizard apprentices placed their hands on the crystal towers, and green ripples immediately extended along the spindle-shaped main crystal of the crystal towers, which was 20 to 30 meters tall. When it reached the top of the tower supported by the white bone base, it immediately turned into beams of green light and shot out in all directions. The green line connected to the other direction of the distant battlefield, and when it hit the crystal tower in that direction, the nearby sea of bones immediately lit up with green spots of light. Almost all the liches looked down at the sparkling emeralds inlaid on the bone staff in their hands. When they looked up again, rows of skeleton soldiers began to slowly turn around, and on the entire battlefield, it was as if a huge wheel had formed in an instant. The Bonefire Legion has entered the south of the Lorwade Hills. The Death Vulture Knight is ready to join the battle. Pale Knight, prepare to join the battle. Black Plague Legion, prepare for the next wave of attack. The undead were adjusting their attacks. Beams of green light crisscrossed in the air above the battlefield, instantly forming a dark green net above the undead army. But the good times did not last long. There was a commotion in the tide-like cluster of crystals. Suddenly, a large number of behemoths with mountain-sized clusters of crystals on their backs emerged. The moment they appeared, they immediately raised their heads and let out ear-piercing shrieks. The crystal beams on their backs vibrated at a high frequency, and the resonance of the sound waves spread out at a speed visible to the naked eye. At the front line of the undead army, the smaller crystal towers began to crack and crumble. Further away, the green beams of light began to become disorderly. In the sea of bones, the green spots of light began to disappear one by one. It was as if the entire battlefield had darkened in an instant. Change the flag signal, idiots. Her ice-cold eyes reflected this scene, but she didn't seem to be surprised at all. However, the undead lords behind her had already turned around and roared at their subordinates. Black sword-shaped flags were erected on the battlefield. Erwin's knight was still moving forward, as if to separate a path in the sea of crystal clusters. Insursta looked back at the direction of Madara's army. His dark eyes were full of dark clouds, and the black flags reflected a thick shadow in the depths of his pupils. "My lord, we have to find a way to get rid of those strange things." He couldn't help but shout anxiously. "What did you call me, Mr. Insursta?" Brando asked as he looked at the huge monsters that suddenly appeared in the crystal clusters. Occasionally, one or two crystal clusters would pounce on them, but he didn't even look at them and cut off their heads with his sword. "As long as you can help Madara win this war, I'll work for you as long as you don't mind having a dark noble as your retainer." Insursta gritted his teeth and said loudly. Tarkus split the head of a crystal cluster with his sword. He looked back and wanted to say something, but after thinking for a while, he shook his head and didn't speak. Brando looked back at him and said with some surprise, "I had an undead retainer in the Cruz Empire. You're not the first, Mr. Insursta. But can you represent the will of the Mercury Staff? The Dark Nobles are free, not just our will." Brando urged his horse forward and shook his head. "Your proposal is very tempting, Mr. Insursta. But I don't want to threaten anyone. If you're willing to come to the Abyss to work for me, I'll welcome you. But for now, let's think about how to win first." He said loudly, "Help me count how many there are. Don't miss any." Insursta opened his mouth wide and stared blankly at Brando. The reason he said those words was that he was full of pride. Just like Brando firmly believed that the Black Lord would become the future of Madara, Insursta also knew his own value. He was a genius. He never denied this and was proud of it. Even if it was the rumored Tariq, he never felt that he was inferior to him. He was the pride of the Pale Rose, the first noble to complete the dark transformation before the age of 18 in 100 years in the central region of the Sea of the Dead Moon. Even his deputy, Tarkus, who was praised by everyone, could only stand behind him. He was very clear that the human in front of him was definitely aware of his value. He had long discovered that the other party's understanding of him was even more thorough than his own. Without a doubt, this Count was also an outstanding person, and only a stupid person would be jealous of a virtuous person. Those who were truly above others would only use them for themselves. "Are you in a daze, Mr. Insursta?" Brando tilted his head and said, "This is a battle for your country. I thought you didn't want to give this glory to Medisha." "I'm sorry?" Insursta immediately raised his head. His somewhat panicked gaze swept across the battlefield. "They are in the east and west. There are a total of 27, no 28. 29. Tarkus remained silent as he answered. He pointed out the new crystal monsters that appeared on the battlefield one by one, and then looked back at his partner. Insursta's face alternated between red and white. Brando did not look at the two of them. "Medisha, help me count." He raised his hand and opened his 5 fingers slightly. Space. Without warning, a huge crystal cluster that was screaming suddenly flew up from the sea of crystals. It was still waving its limbs in panic, obviously not understanding what had happened for a moment. Then the second one, the third one, the fourth one by one the crystal clusters were called out, and then rose from the sea of crystal clusters. Far behind the undead army, the undead lords who were about to use flag signals to give orders suddenly froze. They turned around one after another and looked at this scene dumbfounded. Only that pair of pitch-black eyes still did not have a trace of emotion. This is? Someone is helping us. Someone suddenly shouted in a low voice. 27, 28, 29. But when the last giant crystal cluster rose into the sky, there was a sudden commotion among the crystal clusters. This commotion spread out in all directions like water ripples. The woman on the high platform turned around and faced all her subjects with a cold expression. The undead lords seemed to have woken up from a dream. "Quick, don't waste time, attack them." They gave orders at the top of their lungs. The undead's crystal tower became bright once again. "Mr. Insursta, go and contact your majesty. You know what we need." Brando raised his right hand, and the 29 giant crystal clusters were fixed in the air by him like toys. He said to Insursta with a calm expression. Medisha also looked at the future Black Lord of Madara. Adni and her knight looked at Brando as if he was a god. Just by looking at the 29 monsters that could not move in his hand, they could understand what kind of great power it was. Quill's eyes were full of light. "My lord, Insursta answered a little awkwardly. "Now is not the time to discuss this, Mr. Insursta. Only how to win is what we need to consider." Brendel shook his head. Even he was a little surprised. He thought that he could at most lift 2/3 of them and that would be good enough. But at this moment he felt that a strange way of thinking dominated his current state. He seemed to be looking at himself from a higher dimension. The power of the laws in his body was restless. The traditional knowledge of time and space seemed to be leaving him. The point was, after the battle with Rushta, he felt the power of the elemental orb again. And this time, they were more powerful, so majestic that it seemed to shock the mind. He resisted the shock on the spiritual level and said to Insursta word by word, "I know you can contact your majesty. Hurry up." Insursta nodded silently but then shook his head. "I'm sorry, my lord. You're right. But I don't think we need to contact his majesty. The liches of Balakarivo are already entering the field," he said in a sincere tone and turned back. Brando followed his gaze and turned his head. There was a continuous flash of light on the ground line. Chapter 1299. Rows of wizards wrapped in black robes were entering from the back of the undead army. There were hundreds and thousands of them. Compared to the fiery front line, the scene here was strangely silent. These white bone claws stretched out from under the sleeves of the robes and held the magic staffs in their hands. The magic staffs were completely different from the simple bone staffs in the hands of the necromancers. They were made of dark metal, like the metal of the underworld that could connect the two worlds in the legends. On the top of the magic staffs, the king's tear glowed. This was the first undead magic army from Balakarivo, the army of liches that shocked the world in the Battle of Cypher. In the wild wind on the battlefield, a skeletal hand lifted the hood of a cloak, revealing a pale skull underneath. The dark red light in Victor's eye sockets stared at the sky above the battlefield. Madara, the black rose of the Roman Empire, was withering. Rows of wizards in the same black robes walked to his side and stood side by side with him, forming a long line on the battlefield. A silent battle line. But Madara, all things must wither, all things must sleep forever. Martha above, everything is so consistent with the law and common sense. The king of liches, the ruler of Balakarivo, Victor raised the bone staff in his hand. The king of jewels, the Prometheus diamond unearthed from the sea of the dead moon, emitted a dim light in the wind. The undead lost the sky and the freedom to fly, but they still had magic. Death was still enough to engulf everything. Eternal darkness. It uttered a monotonous word from its dry throat. All things die, everyone said in unison. One by one, magic circles unfolded on the horizon. They rotated as if they were opening a door of light that shone faintly. A ray of green light rose from the horizon and was reflected in the depths of Brendel's eyes. It seemed to draw a long parabola from the distant horizon, turning into a stream of light as it approached from afar. Everyone turned their heads subconsciously. The green beam of light left a long afterimage in his field of vision. Right in the middle of the sea of crystal clusters, it exploded with a loud bang. It was like a plague flower that was emitting a dark green light had bloomed. The crystal clusters were lifted up by the huge shockwave and were thrown into the air before falling down like raindrops. Careful, this is a test shot. Insursta shouted. As if to fulfill his words, a green curtain of light gradually rose from the horizon. They were like countless suns rising into the sky. They arrived in the blink of an eye. It fell on the crystal cluster's position like a rainstorm. The 29 giant crystal clusters instantly turned into fine powder. The green streams of light smashed into the sea of crystal clusters one after another. Every time they landed, a huge gap would be blasted open in the dense purple sea. In almost an instant, the crystal clusters had no choice but to retreat. This was the first time they had retreated since the start of the battle. Frank was so excited that he felt as if he had returned to the Holy War 60 years ago. He did not seem to care about the death magic that was flying over his head. He shouted to everyone, "Sir, the undead are covering us. This is our chance." "Where is the opportunity?" Brando asked in a loud voice as well. "Go around to the flank of the crystal clusters." Medisha looked around and immediately replied, "After the undead's magic is over, the crystal clusters will organize a new attack. Then it will be time for us to play a role." Frank gave the little silver elf princess a thumbs up from the back of his horse. "What do you think?" Brando looked at Insursta. "That is, if the Black Plague Legion can withstand it?" Insursta nodded as well. Brando could not ignore the opinions of the three top commanders. He looked up and quickly chose a route in the chaotic battlefield. The silver crescent and lily flag moved on the battlefield once again. There was finally a hint of admiration in the depths of the dark eyes that watched the battlefield. She nodded. "Is the Black Plague Legion in place?" "They are in place, Your Majesty. But what about the Air Force?" Isaac looked worriedly at the army of crystal clusters above his head. The beetles had almost flown to the sky above the battlefield, and the huge monster in the clouds was also slowly moving in this direction. She looked up at the sky with a gloomy expression, but then lowered her long eyelashes and said, "Don't worry about them." Rows of Crusader executioners with heavy shields walked out from the sea of skeleton soldiers. They came to the front line and lined up in rows. Soon they formed a solid three-layered defense line on the battlefield. The necromancers looked out through the gaps between the shields of these huge undead heavy infantry. Beams of green light were falling from that direction, and the light of the explosions was endless. A huge gap appeared on the battlefield. On the left wing of the Black Plague Legion, thousands of pale knights emitting fluorescent light were moving in a roundabout way. They raised their hands. The necromancers in the back immediately turned around and threw out communication spells. These spells were gathered by the frontline commanders, and the low-level necromancers used their communication crystals to transmit the information to the nearest crystal tower, which then converged it to the command center of the entire battlefield. The Black Plague Legion was in place. Prepare for the second wave of impact. The second wave of attack has arrived. At the moment when the spells of the Lich Legion ended, the purple tide formed by the crystal clusters swept over again. They spread across the gap on the battlefield in a few seconds and crashed in this direction. This time, it was not the four-legged arthropod-like crystal clusters that were charging at the forefront. Instead, it was the crystal cluster beetles that were thick and strong but had a low center of gravity. They were the attackers recorded by the undead. These crystal clusters with extremely high explosive power had always been the backbone of the crystal cluster army. Prepare for the attack. They are expected to arrive in 5 minutes. The necromancers quickly gave out orders one after another. But to everyone's surprise, the first ones to arrive were not the charging crystal clusters, but the beetles in the sky. The beetle army finally flew over the undead army at this moment. They let out a piercing shriek and immediately began to dive into Madara's position. The beetles opened their claws and teeth, cutting into the undead formation like a sharp blade. Almost in an instant, the front of the Black Plague Legion was shaken. Erwin's silver-white flag broke out of the encirclement at this moment. The flag circled around the right wing of the Crystal Cluster army and came back from the direction of the hills. Blank looked at the scene with a solemn expression. It's over. The monster's advantage in the air is too obvious. The undead can't hold on for much longer. There must be a chance, Insursta said loudly. Is there still a chance? Brando pulled the reins and turned around to ask. Medisha froze for a moment. What's wrong with you, Medisha? No, nothing. Medisha's expression was a little strange. My lord, what are you going to do? There is still a chance. Brando narrowed his eyes and replied, if I can stop the attack of the Crystal Cluster army in the front, Insursta, Medisha, can you find a chance? What did you say, Mr. Brando? Adney questioned loudly. We can't do that. It's not us, it's me. Brando turned around and asked solemnly, what will happen? Everyone was stunned. Blank gulped and replied, if the undead can draw out a fresh army, the undead can draw out a fresh army. Medisha suddenly reacted at this time. Her silver eyes flashed with an inexplicable light. My lord, if you can do it, we can win this war. Medisha. My lord, please leave the command of the battlefield to Mr. Insursta. I believe he can do it well, Medisha replied firmly. Brando glanced at the silver elf princess. Their eyes met as if their hearts were connected. Then I'll leave it to you. Lady Delphian. Delphian looked up at him. Protect yourself. The Prime Minister's daughter was slightly stunned. Her eyes flashed with an inexplicable light. Brando turned around and held Odorfice in his hand. With his back facing them, he said, Mr. Insursta, don't let us down. He clamped the horse's belly and made the warhorse speed up. He leaned back slightly and rushed to the center of the battlefield. My lord. Insursta looked at the other person's back in disbelief. He muttered, you really made me look at you in a new light, Mr. Insursta, Medisha reminded him. Miss Medisa, Insursta knew that the silver elf princess was Medisa's confidant, so he turned around and solemnly said to her, I hope we can work together happily from now on. We will fight side by side. No, the little princess shook her head and smiled. This war belongs to you, Mr. Insursta. It doesn't belong to me. The future Black Lord of Madara was stunned. The pale undead army, the dark land, and the purple crystal ocean. The three colors intertwined under the sky and slowly approached each other. Spears were being lowered in rows. The undead soldiers knew no fear. Only the flames of eternal death were dancing in the depths of their eyes. Lightning shuttled through the clouds. Meteorites were falling from the distant sky with long tails of flames. But in between the two distinct colors, a human knight appeared at this moment. A man, a horse, and a long sword shining with golden light, pierced between the undead army and the waves of crystal clusters. Who is that? The undead lords were in a panic. Their panicked voices rose and fell one after another. Her dark eyes reflected the figure of the man standing upright on the horse. The wind blew his long hair and fluttered in the air. She pursed her lips and held the mercury staff tightly in her pale hand. She didn't say a word. She recognized that person. Everything in the prophecy. Brando tightened the reins of the horse. He turned the horse's head and blocked between the undead army and the waves of crystal clusters. Behind the rows of undead heavy infantrymen who were retreating under the attack of the horseshoe beetles, countless liches and necromancers looked at this scene at a loss. Why was there a human here? What was he doing here? Was he crazy? But Brando's back was facing them. In his eyes, a purple line appeared on the horizon in front of him. It covered the entire battlefield and was rapidly becoming clearer. In the torrent, there were monsters baring their fangs and brandishing their claws. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. He also wanted to ask himself if he was crazy, but a clear voice in his heart told him that he could do it. Because in his body, the voice of the law was resonating. It was the power of time, space, and the whole world. They were intertwined with each other. That was the power of existence. The power of the elemental orb had completely resonated. Brando raised his hand. A continuous silver network suddenly appeared above the clouds. This network spread from front to back and covered the entire battlefield in a flash. Everyone looked up in shock. The bright network was reflected in their eyes. The power of the sage. There was a soft bang. The Mercury staff fell on the high platform. P.S. It's the 23rd. Please vote next month, everyone. Chapter 1300. The cold wind was like a line passing through the battlefield, the gravel was like smoke across the dark ground, the collar of the count's coat swayed in one direction, a hand pressed it down and straightened it. The purple jade marrow button reflected a thin line in the sky. Brando was like a straight spear on the horse's back, facing all of this. The big earthquake rumbled, the small stone pieces moved horizontally on the solid ground. The light in the sky gradually dimmed, the setting sun was burning, emitting the last trace of heat. A silver network stretched out from the clouds behind him, over his head and stretched forward. Silver pulses of light cascaded forward, connected to each other, grid by grid, glittering. The wind blew his long hair, the dark brown hair swept across his cheeks, strand by strand. Brando's expression was calm, as if he was standing and listening to a distant song. That song was like a gust of wind that traveled tens of thousands of miles across the battlefield, carrying with it countless ideals and countless memories. Thousands of voices, overlapping each other, thousands of wills, converged into one. Clouds and mist walked on the battlefield. The illusory night stopped, their blurry faces seemed to have a gaze, watching one end of the battlefield. In every corner of the battlefield, 27 ancient kings with laurel crowns on their heads turned their heads, they held their swords in their hands, but they all cast their gazes in one direction. The Lionheart sword shone brightly. 780 years ago, a team of knight arrived at today's Gray Mane Valley. A man held his sword in front of the knight and said, "I swear by my sword, Erwin will bear the glory, sweep away all oppression and injustice. My people, my subjects, will follow the oath of the sages and walk along this path. If one day the glory abandons us, this sword will no longer protect this country." 1,600 years ago, a flag was slowly raised on the battlefield of the Great Plains, reflecting the first rays of the dawn of that day. Then why are we fighting? Knight, people of Cruz, my brothers, for victory, for the future, for tomorrow, for our descendants, no longer living under the shadow of the Myernas. What we need is not charity. Men, tell me, what do we need? The king holding the golden flame blade listened attentively. A long wind blew through the clouds. The migratory bird spread its wings, making a rustling sound. 990 years ago, the Mist Elves established a country in the Supreme Court. This everlasting forest will be our kingdom from now on. Elves, we have traveled thousands of miles just to find this everlasting land. We were born here and we will sleep here. From now on there will be no more wars. An epoch ago, two great wills met above the clouds. Dusk, this era is different, the future will no longer belong to you and us. The knight raised his spear and made an oath. A speck of green light appeared in the sky, as resplendent as the sunset. Then, thousands upon thousands of voices resounded in his mind, creating a cacophony of noise. Then why should we give up our authority? Can you be sure of the consequences of failure? What is Martha doing? This is the last time we'll give in, restart the world. I'm sorry we failed. Brando closed his eyes. Listen, this is the voice of the sages. The struggles of countless generations, the blood and sacrifice of countless generations, those that were recorded in history, and those that were forgotten by history. The long river flowed, like the sparkling light on the river. Every memory fragment was like the flow of an epic. And there was an ultimate answer to all of this. When Brando opened his eyes again, the silver grid was reflected in the depths of his eyes, like a silver flame burning fiercely. He looked up, his gaze seemed to be able to penetrate the clouds, seeing the rows of arrays outside the wound world. Countless rays of light were hanging down from these satellites, penetrating the clouds and falling to the ground. The entire battlefield seemed to be divided by the silver line. This is the law of Tiamat. Time and space, energy and mass, at this time and place, there is no distinction between them. What is the ultimate power in this world? Existence. Countless people have sacrificed countless lives to achieve all of this. It is so that we can exist in this world, so that civilization and order can continue to exist, so that our ideals and beliefs can continue to shine. So, a voice said softly, we have no reason to retreat. A translucent female figure seemed to be projected from the clouds, landing beside Brando. Her figure moved slightly as if she would disappear at any time. Lady Tiamat, perhaps I should call you Martha? Me? Martha. Not even close. That is not a power that I can seize, it does not belong to me. The woman smiled and shook her head. So all of this was arranged by you? Who exactly are you? Brando felt the power resonating in his body. If he still did not understand what was going on at this moment, he would have wasted his life's experience. He asked softly. Haku looked at him and mouthed 3 words. The ultimate saint. Then what? You still don't have an answer in your heart. Haku turned around, looking at the approaching crystal cluster army, and answered. What kind of power is this? Brando raised his head and looked at the silver pillars of light descending from the sky, penetrating the clouds like raindrops, and falling on the horizon. This is the power of the entire world. This world was formed by it and was born for it. It is what the Twilight Dragon has been searching for, the truth of the world, but unfortunately, it only belongs to the true king. The true king? Who are you talking about? Haku looked at him and shook his head. Maybe it is you, but not really. But maybe one day you will get that key. So, take the opportunity now and feel it well. This may be the last thing I can do for you. Brando did not understand the meaning behind this sentence. He took a deep breath, the tremors of the earth becoming more and more obvious. The crystal cluster army was almost in front of him. He raised his head and stared at the battlefield in front of him. At that moment, it was as if thousands of wills were added to him, countless voices lingering and echoing in his mind, converging into a sentence. This is our power, our country, our civilization, our history. This is time and space, the sharp blade given to us by God. This is Amber, the sword that changes fate. One day it will backtrack everything, change everything. Take a step forward, our successor, our king. We will personally crown you, put on the laurel crown, bathe in the mountains, take over this power, and end all of this fate in chains. Brando raised his 5 fingers and gently pushed. Directly opposite the Black Plague army, the entire army facing the Crystal Cluster army. With a loud bang, millions of crystal clusters left the ground, struggling helplessly in midair. There was a moment of dead silence on the battlefield. Outside Won's atmosphere, in the array that was arranged like a star ring, the surface of tens of millions of satellites burst out bright light belts, emitting intense light and operating wildly. A bright river of light hung upside down in the sky above the entire world. It stretched across the sky, like a flowing Milky Way, emitting bright light. At that moment, the entire world resonated, and a voice seemed to reverberate in the depths of the world. The scepter of truth was slowly descending from the sky above the world. It was held tightly in Brando's hand. Her Majesty the Queen of Madara even forgot to pick up her Mercury staff. The Death Lords did not notice their monarch's loss of composure at all. Adeline covered her mouth in disbelief. Tarkus tightened the reins, looking at this scene with a complicated expression. Martha Ayabov. The knights squeezed out these few words from the depths of their throats. Behind everyone, Medisha looked at this scene in high spirits, her eyes full of deep admiration. But she glanced at her companions, turned her horse around, and galloped in one direction without looking back. Attack, attack? Among the Death Lords, someone asked dryly. Insursta suddenly turned his head. Where are the reinforcements? Where are the reinforcements? He asked sternly. The Crystal Cluster Army's frontal attack was really stopped by that person alone, and a huge gap appeared in their front line. He suddenly realized that at this time, as long as there was a fresh force that could insert into this weak point on the battlefield from the flank, then this war would be settled. But where were the reinforcements? The Black Plague Army? No, they were not enough. He and Brando turned their heads at the same time to look for Medisha's figure, but there was no trace of the Silver Elf Princess. Insursta and the Marshal looked at each other. The wind on the battlefield suddenly became stronger. Brando turned his head, his messy hair almost covering his eyes and blurring his vision, but he did not speak in silence. He was just waiting for the arrival of the fresh force that Medisha had mentioned. He believed in this Silver Elf Princess as much as he believed in himself. He knew that Medisha would never lie to him. He was waiting quietly. But there was not much time left for him. Above his head, the galaxy was still shining brightly. Tiamaza's projection was beside him, his expression unchanged. The wind became wild. The wind that swept across the battlefield seemed to come out of nowhere. In the camp of the undead, the black flags were suddenly raised high one by one, flapping loudly. In the blink of an eye, it was a sea of flags. The airflow swept up the gravel like a dust storm, sweeping across the entire battlefield. The Death Wizards and Liches raised their heads. The Death Lords and the Death Lords turned their heads back at the same time. In their throbbing soulfire eyes, the fluttering black rose flags were reflected, but there was a trace of doubt in the depths of their eyes. Where did this wind come from? Chapter 1301. The wind came from the hills in the west. There was a legend that was often spread among the bards who traveled all over the place. The wind blew and the giant beasts walked in the sky. And the wind was the sound of their wings flapping. What is that? A necromancer suddenly screamed. It was 4 long intersecting silver lines. They were like 4 dazzling sharp swords that streaked across the sky of the entire battlefield in an instant. Wherever they passed, the crystal clusters and locusts in the sky fell like raindrops. Everyone subconsciously raised their heads and looked at the silver lines that extended forward. They drew an arc at the end of their vision and flew back. This time they could see clearly that it was a vigorous giant dragon. But on their slender necks, not only were there giant dragon horns on their huge heads, there was also a single horn that was straight forward. Dragon? No, that is. Knights in silver armor sat on long saddles, one in front and one behind. The knight in front held a 5-meter-long shuttle-shaped spear, and the knight behind held a huge shield. Their faces were completely covered under the silver armor. Exquisite and mysterious patterns were engraved on the metal, cold and arrogant. It was as if they were describing the most glorious identity that belonged to them 1,000 years ago. Silver elf guards, Dragon King cavalry. They raised their spears high. Varler. The dragon knight shouted in unison. Varler. The cry of victory resounded through the sky. Behind them, silver dots of light flickered in the sky like stars, appearing on the eastern horizon. Silver elves. The undead lords could not believe it. Martha above, those are silver elves. It was a silver torrent that was sweeping down from the top of the Lorwade hills. It was countless heavy night. Their snow-silver armor shone under the setting sun, and the snow-white feathers on the top of their helmets rose and fell like waves. The silver double-ended swords in their hands and the elven longbows on their backs proved the identity of the knight. They had defeated the Myrnas, the natives, the witches, and the undead army in Veloka. Their glory was recorded on the metal on their chests. It was a cross between a spear and a sword. The sword belonged to Frostsinger Cinna, while the spear belonged to a hero. That hero. She used to be their princess. They were the Soderkara heavy cavalry, the Lingu army, the pride of the elves. 1,000 years later, after the War of the Holy Saints, the Silver Elves finally returned to this land for the sake of this war that no one could stay out of. Above everyone's heads, the dragons began to accelerate and plunged into the sky above the battlefield. A small figure was riding a warhorse towards the Silver Elves' heavy cavalry. Medisha's long hair fluttered in the wind. The mystical horse she was riding was getting closer and closer to the charging Silver Elves. When the two formed a parallel line, she suddenly raised her head, raised her spear and shouted, "Slaver Klarvarler! Victory to the holy land of Soa!" The Silver Elven Knight turned around and looked at her. Their eyes showed a trace of doubt, but then this doubt turned into ecstasy. They raised their swords and placed them in front of their chests. That was the highest etiquette of the Silver Elven warriors. That was wordless trust. It was the highest form of respect for a hero. The little princess smiled, her heart full of pride. Illusions intertwined in front of her, as if she had returned to 1,000 years ago, in that dreamy war. That was the war of mortals against fate. They won everything. At this moment, the heroes and warriors had once again returned to fight for the sacred oath. She raised the spear in her hand and shouted with all her might, "Long live the Holy Silver Valley! Long live the Holy Silver Valley!" The Knight Army of the Holy Song Army responded in unison. Their voices resounded on the battlefield like thunder. Knights of Soderkara. Medisha's long hair fluttered in the wind. She waved her spear forward, "Follow me. Long live your highness." The entire heavy knight regiment immediately drew a beautiful arc on the battlefield. From top to bottom, from the regiment commander to the captain, there was not a single person who objected. It was as if this was how it should be, 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 as if this was how it should be. Because she was Medisha, the most legendary army commander in the history of the Lingu army. She was the hero of the elves, a heroic spirit sleeping in the ancient temple. Medisha merged into the vanguard of the heavy cavalry army. It was as if she was holding a bright blade in her hand. This blade had been in her hand 1,000 years ago, and it was the same at this moment. It mercilessly stabbed into the throat of the Crystal Army. At the most appropriate moment, Brando raised his head and looked at the army with relief. There seemed to be a flame burning in his heart. That was Medisha's promise to him. He knew that she would definitely keep it. He let go of his hand. Countless crystal clusters fell from the sky and landed heavily on the ground, causing the entire battlefield to shake. Incersta looked at the elven army that surged past him and could not help but sigh. Even in terms of military talent, he found that he was still slightly inferior to the princess beside that person. Launch the counterattack. He and a ruler of the undead far away on the other side of the battlefield gave this order at the same time. Incersta raised his long sword and led Adni and her knight down from the hills. Her Majesty the Queen lowered her head and picked up the Mercury staff. Her dark eyes finally showed a hint of relief at this moment. Silver elves, you did not fail to keep your promise. The crystal cluster's attack was collapsing. They began to retreat from the entire battlefield, leaving the battle line one by one. The various armies of the undead immediately raised black flags that represented pursuit, regrouped, and threw themselves into the pursuit again. Looking down from the sky above the entire battlefield, in an instant, the battlefield that spanned tens of kilometers began to show signs of being one-sided. The last to retreat was the Crystal Cluster's air force. Under the cover of Leviathan's huge body, they calmly retreated to the south of the battlefield. The Silver Elven Dragon King Knight immediately went up to entangle them, but a few White Dragon King Knights were like mosquitoes beside Leviathan. They could not pose any threat to it at all. Brando knew that if he let this thing leave so easily, this battle would be far from over. And on this battlefield only he had the ability to make it stay. Almost immediately he rose into the air and flew in that direction. But it was at this moment that a black shadow overtook him from behind. Brando was slightly stunned, thinking that it was fast. He looked up and found that it was a silver-haired girl who overtook him. She obviously did not look like an undead. She wore a very strange armor. The style of the armor was very different from the traditional style of wound. The surface was full of streamlined lines and the material seemed to be metal, but the surface was full of crystal lattice networks. It seemed more similar to the remains of the gods he saw in the deadly frost forest. Andrea turned her head and looked at Brando with a shocked expression, but she did not intend to say much. She only remembered the young man's face deeply and then continued to fly forward. Freya? Brando was shocked when he saw the face of the other side. Although the silver-haired girl's mask covered the upper half of her face, the lower half of her face and the Valkyrie mark on her forehead were very similar to Freya's. Needless to say, the 3 pairs of light wings on her back were Freya's Valkyrie armament. But Andrea turned a deaf ear to his shouts. She began to accelerate in mid-air, and soon other Valkyries appeared in the sky. They flew to Leviathan above the clouds and then threw black balls forward. Those black balls rotated in the sky and soon fixed in place, suspended in mid-air. A ring-shaped red light beam appeared on their surface and then connected with each other, locking the mountain-like Leviathan in a red light net. Coordinates confirmed. Andrea called out, "Lord Dragon King, please descend." Dragon King? Brando was stunned, wondering if the dragon god Bahamut still existed in this world. But before he had time to question this guess in his heart, he heard a cold snort from the sky. A dazzling golden eye opened above the clouds. Then a pair of wings that covered the sky appeared. Was a dragon. Its size was actually not inferior to Leviathan, who was cruising in the sky. As soon as it appeared, it pressed its claw towards Leviathan's head. The huge claw seemed to be able to tear the clouds apart as it clawed towards the horn on Leviathan's head. The shadow of the claw swept across the ground, causing the sky above the battlefield to darken. Leviathan let out a roar. It swung its body, obviously unwilling to give in. But unfortunately, silver spots of light flashed on the dragon's claws. Brando was so frightened that he almost cried out. He saw that those were not silver spots of light, but bright silver cards. These cards rotated in midair and then gathered into one. A cold voice came out of the dragon's mouth. Deliver the final blade. A black shadow that spanned across the sky swept across Leviathan's huge body. Leviathan let out a shrill scream, and its huge body was cut in two. The broken part turned into countless crystal fragments and slowly fell from the sky. 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7. Brendel silently counted the number of horns on the dragon's head that peeked out from the clouds. There were exactly 7 of them, no more, no less. In this world, only one dragon had 7 horns. That was the legendary lover of Odin. That was the evil dragon king, the teacher of the death hound of the Rubik Desert, Orglaith. Players called her Master Craftsman, the 7 Dragon King, Fuchsia. But she was actually a planeswalker. P.S. Begging for votes. Writing is so tiring, I'm rolling on the ground. Chapter 1302. Leviathan's mountain-like corpse stood on the horizon, reflecting the blood-red sun. Dusk clouds hung low, and a few crystal clusters hovered above it, making their last stand. On the battlefield, the battle was nearing its end. Looking down from the sky, the silver torrent representing the elven army of Quelliner's Holy Silver Valley and the black army of the Undead Moon Empire were divided into 4 groups, chasing after the remaining purple parts on the black ground from all directions. The crystal clusters were torn apart, scattering into the fog in all directions. In the sky, black warships were entering the battlefield. Those ghost-like floating warships appeared in the sky like shadows. Space was distorted on a large scale, and in the distortion, these warships turned into solid entities. "Your Majesty, our fleet has entered the battlefield." "Umph." The Supreme One holding the Mercury staff coldly snorted, but there wasn't a single trace of emotion in his pitch-black eyes. Everyone, or rather the undead, knew that Lich Dai Lin definitely had ulterior motives. "Tell Dalen that I came just in time. Tell him to prepare for battle." Isaac was stunned and quickly lowered his head. "But Your Majesty, the battle is nearing its end." The woman turned around and inadvertently glanced at him. This glance made Isaac feel as if he had fallen into an ice cave, as if his thoughts had been completely seen through by the other party. This necromancer trembled in fear and hurriedly lowered his head. "I understand, Your Majesty." "What do you understand, Isaac?" She pointed her snow-white index finger at the battlefield and asked, "Is there only one enemy left for the Undead Moon Empire?" The Queen's tone was casual, but the undead lords looked at each other. Brando descended from the sky. The undead's fleet entered the battlefield and dealt the final blow to the crystal clusters and the beetles. With the presence of the goddess of war and the 7 dragons king, there was no need for him to interfere in the battle in the sky. When he landed on the ground, he immediately saw Delphine's anxious face. He couldn't help but be a little surprised. He wondered when this woman had become so concerned about him. He knew that her obedience these days was just a disguise, but the look on her face didn't seem to be fake. However, the first to greet him wasn't the Prime Minister's daughter, but Insursta. "Mr. Brando, please leave this place immediately. This is a map of the east side of the Sea of the Dead Moon. You can take the shortest route to Erewhon if you follow the map. If that doesn't work, you can go to Lubeck and take a boat from Lubeck to Erewhon. It's much more convenient than 9 Phoenix." The future star of Madara said to Brando as soon as he saw him. He took out a crystal from his arms. Brando recognized it as a messaging crystal at a glance. Anyone with a little bit of magical ability liked to use this messaging crystal to record messages. "What's wrong?" Brando was stunned. "His Majesty the Emperor of Madara may want to harm you, my lord." The Prime Minister's daughter frowned and said, "After the undead's fleet entered the battlefield, the situation has become unfavorable for us. Even if the Silver Elves are on our side, we are still at a disadvantage. Besides, the Silver Elves may not be willing to stand up for us, even if Medisha is their princess." Brando's heart skipped a beat. He immediately realized that it was possible. He recalled the behavior of this supreme undead in the game. No matter how he looked at it, she was definitely not a merciful or indecisive person. If she recognized his identity, she might really attack him, even if it was just to make her attack on Erewhon more successful. How dare she? Adeline was in disbelief. The Dragon Queen is still in the sky. Will she sit by and watch the undead betray their allies? Delphian shook her head. She did not agree with the naive commander's opinion. The 7-pole Dragon Queen, Fuchsia, was an ally of the undead in history. Don't forget the relationship between the undead and the Myurnas. Even if we take a step back with her status, it is unlikely that she will interfere in the affairs of the mortal world. This is completely different from the war with the crystal. The Prime Minister's daughter's mind was clear, and she immediately understood the underlying relationship. Brendel also understood that even though he did not know what role the Nameless Ones and Fuchsia played in this war, it was hard to say if they would intervene in the mortal world's war. He also wouldn't place his hopes on an illusory possibility. Insursta hurriedly nodded. "Mr. Brando, Delphian is right. Her Majesty is determined to get Erewhon. She has also heard of your performance in the First War of the Black Roses. Coupled with your previous performance, she may have already given the order to attack you. Mr. Brando," he advised earnestly, "you have extraordinary skills. It will not be difficult for you to take Miss Adeline and the others away from here. There is really no need to fight the Imperial fleet. If I'm not wrong, the commanders of the 7 legions and their retainers mean that the Empire has at least 10 supreme-class elites here. No matter how strong you are, after dealing with them, how will you fight the undead army?" Brando could not help but look at Insursta with some surprise. "Do you know what you are doing, Mr. Insursta?" "Of course I do. But the Dark Nobles must keep their promises, Mr. Brando. Besides, I don't want to see you clash with the Empire, especially now. Brando looked up. Thank you, Insursta, but it may be a little too late now. Insursta turned his head and his expression changed slightly. He cursed inwardly because he saw that the Death Moon Empire's fleet in the sky was changing their formation, but it was not a pursuit formation. Instead, it was a beautiful arc battle line. It was obvious that Lich Dalen, who commanded the fleet, intended to besiege them. In fact, on the battlefield on the ground, the various undead armies were also rushing back. They quickly gathered from several directions and surrounded Brando and the others in the middle of the battlefield. Mr. Brando, do you want me to talk to Her Majesty? Perhaps she will change her attitude on account of your help to the Empire? Insursta was afraid that Brando would suddenly attack. The scene of Brando blocking the Crystal Cluster Legion alone had left a deep impression in his heart. The Empire might be able to keep him, but they would definitely pay a terrible price. However, the threat of the Crystal Cluster was far from over. They had won one war, but what about the next? Insursta was puzzled. Why couldn't Her Majesty see through this? Come to think of it, the Empire seemed to have some kind of obsession with a small place like Erewhon. Although Erewhon's strategic position was important, it was not to the point where it was on the same level as the future life and death of the Roman Tuo's Black Rose. He subconsciously looked at his partner, the vampire Tarkus. He knew that he had always been weak in politics, otherwise he would not have been sent to a place like Rosaline. His deputy, who was born in an ancient and prominent blood clan family in the south, was far more talented in this area than he was. Tarkus remained silent, only silently shaking his head. Delphian, who had been frowning, happened to see this scene. The Prime Minister's daughter seemed to have grasped some clues from it. She narrowed her eyes slightly and a light flashed in her light purple eyes. Call me Lord Insursta. Brando looked around and took in the mobilization of the spirits. Everyone around him looked solemn. Adney and her knight were ready for battle again. The elf ranger Nukwal also took out an arrow, but when he touched the quiver behind him, he could not help but frown. After the previous battle, there were not many arrows left. The Knights of Ra's Wings were the elites of the Kingdom of Rubik. Adney naturally did not want to lose them in a foreign land, let alone fight for a stranger. But now she did not say a word because in her heart she had long believed that Brando was the messenger of the sun god Ra. If he was not the messenger of Ra, how could he have the power of a sage? Was the so-called sage not a demigod of mortals? Hearing Brando's words, Insursta was slightly stunned. He raised his head and looked at Brando in shock, not quite understanding what he meant. Brando replied, "From now on, you are my retainer." This was a break. Insursta smiled bitterly. He did not expect that the fragile alliance between Erewhon and Madara would only last for such a short time on the battlefield. Perhaps this alliance was one-sided in the first place. The Count had helped Madara out of the spirit of an ancient noble, but Her Majesty had never approved of this. The battle had just ended and she was going to attack Erewhon's people. As a member of the spirits, he could understand the thoughts of the Supreme One with the Mercury Staff, but at this moment he found it difficult to agree. "My lord," he sighed, "I can pledge my loyalty to you. Through the fog to the west we can reach Somia. Let's break out in that direction." "You don't want me to clash with the Empire?" Brando understood what he was implying. "My lord, you know very well that this war is not just a war between the spirits and the Crystal Cluster. If..." Brando looked at the army of the undead that was coming from all directions. At this moment, the sky was getting dark and the sky in the east was faintly purple. Stars twinkled above the clouds and under the night sky, the dark army was dancing with the light of countless soul flames. He replied, "I understand what you said, but you don't quite understand Your Majesty's painstaking efforts." Insursta was slightly stunned. He raised his head and looked at him, not quite understanding the meaning of this sentence for a moment. Above the clouds, the undead fleets were still moving about. Fuchsia was observing everything that was happening on the ground through her golden eyes. Bramanto's Black Rose's actions did not escape her eyes. She snorted coldly and said in a disdainful tone, "That's right. Little girl." Chapter 1303. In the fog, the changes on the battlefield were so fast that it was hard to understand. The undead legion that was chasing after the Crystal Cluster had surrounded their original allies. Coincidentally, the Black Plague Legion that had escaped because of Brando was now facing off against Medicia's Linga guards. Of course, they were no match for the Silver Elves. However, there were 3 other legions on the left and right of the Black Plague Legion that were closely monitoring the Silver Elves' every move. The undead legion's floating fleet lined up in midair, but they did not dare to act rashly. Right in front of them was the Silver Elves' Dragon King cavalry. There were only a few hundred of them, but their illustrious reputation in history was enough to make any floating fleet tremble in fear. Lich Dai Lin clearly didn't plan on losing more than half of his forces here. Brando's team was behind the Elven Knight. There were now 2 Silver Elves in the team. One of them was naturally Medisha, while the other was the commander of the Silver Elf Salakad Knight squad. Speaking of which, Brando had met Salakad once on the battlefield in Ampere Seal. Counting the time at Chablis, this was the 3rd time he had met Salakad. Coincidentally, the situation was similar every time. In Ampere Seal, he used the Elven token to ask the Silver Elves for help. In Chablis, the Silver Elves also happened to help him. Although it was because of Medisha, it was almost the same this time. If the Silver Elves did not come to the rescue, he and the Undead Legion would not have anything to do. There would only be an uncountable number of crystal clusters left on the battlefield. My lord, we meet again. Most of the elves were handsome and the Silver Elves were even more so. Back in Chablis, the commander of the Phoenix Guards, Nalathar, was a super handsome man. Now the commander of the Night Squad was not to be outdone. Brando did not have the strength to be jealous of this natural genetic advantage. He could only smile bitterly. Lord Commander, your presence here makes me feel very pressured. A lot of pressure? Although the Silver Elf Knight did not quite understand the meaning of this sentence in human language, it did not prevent him from understanding Brando's joke and smiling warmly. I'm very sorry. Of course this was a joke. Neither of them took it seriously. Brando raised his head and looked at the sky. What do you plan to do next? That's up to Sir Lord. You guys should leave. It seems that if I don't satisfy her, that Emperor won't let this matter rest. The Silver Elf Knight looked at him and asked, Have you decided? Brando nodded. The latter bowed slightly and looked at Medisha. Your Highness? I want to stay by the Lord's side. But everyone misses you, Your Highness. I'm already very satisfied to be able to fight side by side with everyone after 1,000 years. I don't dare to ask for more. You should go back. The current Medisha is no longer the princess from 1,000 years ago. I'm only the Lord's retainer. I have the duty to stay here and fight side by side with him. Medisha smiled and replied. The Silver Elf Knight sighed and nodded. Then Lord Commander, I hope that we can fight side by side on the real battlefield. Definitely. By the way, send my regards to Nalathar. The last time I went back to Chablis they were no longer there. Brando replied. All the Silver Elves have returned to Holy Silver Valley. We have to make long-term preparations for the upcoming war. The Silver Elf replied, But I will send your regards to him. May the light of the stars and moon always shine on your head. May the light of the stars and moon always be with you. The Silver Elves are retreating. The Undead Lord saw the movement of Lin Ji's guards from afar. The Dragon Knight in the sky also turned around. Although they were not afraid of fighting the Silver Elves were still a force to be reckoned with after the War of the Holy Saints. If there was a choice, there were not many who would be willing to face them. The Undead Lords heaved a sigh of relief. It seemed that the Silver Elves were not willing to fight against Madara for a few mere humans. After all, they should know that only the Empire of the Dead Moon could fight against Twilight with them. Erwin's position in this war was destined not to be in the position of a small kingdom. But amidst the sighs of relief, the pair of cold and indifferent eyes did not have a trace of joy. She turned around and coldly looked at her retainers. Isaac, come with me. The undead army quickly parted to form a path. Brando squinted his eyes. The first thing he saw was the Mercury Staff, and then the person holding the Mercury Staff. The other party was similar to what he remembered, the Emperor of the Dead Moon Empire. Although she should be younger in this era than in history, it did not make much difference to the undead wizards. Her appearance was maintained at the age of 27 or 28, with a very rare head of long black hair and eyes. It was said that Her Majesty the Queen had the blood of the Myrnas, and there was also a saying that she was a descendant of Odin. There was no expression on the Queen's face. This was different from the majesty and arrogance of the Silver Queen Constance. This Supreme of the Undead was purely indifferent, although there were players who privately called her the Queen of Facial Paralysis. But in Brando's memory, this Supreme rarely showed any external emotions. She was like a precise machine ruling the Empire with harsh means. To be honest, he thought that the other party would order an attack without saying anything. The fact that she could appear in front of him was already somewhat beyond his expectations. Insert to Dragon Tarkus. The Supreme of the Undead spoke first, but not to Brando but to the two people beside him. Beside Brando, Blanche's face was instantly filled with anger. Princess Magadal also frowned. Although in terms of status, Brando was far from the Emperor of Madara, but at this moment on the battlefield, the two of them were actually equal in terms of status. Not to mention, Brando's previous display of strength should be enough to win the respect of any ruler of the empire. Perhaps others did not understand the concept of a subordinate dying when the ruler was humiliated, but as a former marshal of the allied armies who was familiar with the rules of the game between nobles, Blanche obviously understood that this woman was showing her contempt for them. For the same reason, Magadol also felt that something was wrong. But Brando did not care. He was still sizing up this legendary monarch. In his previous life, there were only a few people who could see Her Majesty in person. Most of the players' understanding of her came from rare videos and images, as well as some official promotional videos. Speaking of which, this was the first time he met her face to face. "Your Majesty, we are now the Count's prisoners." Tarkus looked at his colleague and calmly replied. Insursta could not help but feel a little grateful. He knew that if he were to answer, he would not be able to lie to the Supreme Emperor. But if he did, he would not be able to avoid the problem of his current status. The Dark Nobles kept their promises. Although he was not afraid to fulfill his promise, he also understood that it was not a wise thing to reveal this issue at this time. Sure enough, once Tarkus spoke, the Queen of Madara turned her gaze to Brando. This time her tone was even colder. "I know who you are, human. I will give you a chance. Submit to me and you can get everything you want." "Everything I want?" The woman looked at him coldly. Her gaze was like a cold blade and no one dared to look at her directly. Brando also frowned subconsciously. He had a strong will. Although he was not afraid, he still felt a little overwhelmed. According to history, this queen was a gifted monarch of Madara. It was as if she was born with the Mercury staff. He originally thought that it was a little exaggerated, but now he realized that it was not entirely true. In this world, there was actually someone with such a strong will. It was even slightly stronger than him. Only such a person could control the power of darkness. Although the dark elemental orb and the scepter were powerful, it was always a heavy burden for anyone who received them. If one's will was not strong enough, it would easily corrupt them, just like those witches who were corrupted by the dark magic and became crazy. Even though Brendel did not refute her words, the Supreme One with the Mercury staff understood what he meant from the latter's words. "This is your answer?" Brando suddenly found it funny. He thought that life was like a play and it was all about acting. This woman looked cold on the surface as if she did not care about anything, but if there was an Oscar in this world, she could easily win a movie queen or something. He nodded. The latter looked at him deeply and turned to leave. The undead army immediately gathered behind her. Brando looked in that direction and suddenly said to himself, "It seems that your queen's ambition is bigger than I thought. If there is a chance, she will definitely get rid of me and Dalen together." As he spoke, he looked back. The next moment, Haku's shadow appeared beside him again. "Sister?" Medisha shouted in surprise. Haku's shadow looked back at her and pretended to be disdainful. She looked straight ahead and said, "If you can't even do this, you deserve to die here. I'm surrounded by an army of undead Lady Tiamas. You're the one who threw us into this place, right? What else can we do other than watch a show for free?" Brendel retorted in annoyance. "There's also the nature orb and the Mercury staff," Haku replied. "Those are also your goals. Then what do you want me to use to fight with this queen? Don't you already have a card up your sleeve, Count?" Haku glanced at him disdainfully. Chapter 1304. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Adney didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. The members of the Ra's Feathered Knights stood on either side of her, their swords pointed outwards as they faced off against the black mass of undead more than 100 meters away. The heavily armored Crusader executioners lowered their spears in rows. Their joints creaked as they collided with each other. The blades reflected the last ray of sunlight below the horizon, and the blades glowed with an obsidian-like luster. Huang Hua sat on her horse, her hand moving to the hilt of her sword. Mr. Willow stood by her side, protecting her. Not far away, Blank and Medisha were ready to break out of the encirclement. The Phantom Chariot's genius swordsman, Fang Qi, seemed to be hesitating. The two elders beside him had grim expressions. Insursta was the only one who kept looking up at the sky. He frowned as if he had thought of something. Not a single crystal cluster could be seen on the battlefield. The horseshoe beetles in the sky had long since disappeared. However, the Strait of Finhodos was deathly silent. The war goddesses hovered a few thousand meters above the ground. Andrea and her companions looked at the scene in bewilderment. They could not understand the art of politics in the mortal world. Let her be. Mortals need these methods to deal with relationships between different classes. I know what you're thinking, but girls, it's not the time for you to interfere. Be a little more reserved. You're all ladies, Fuchsia said in a cold voice. They exchanged glances. The mortals had truly turned politics into an art. It was elegant, nimble, and ruthless. Although it left many wise men exhausted, it was still a huge step forward in the history of civilization. At the very least, it was a step away from bloody barbarism. The losers did not have to worry about being beheaded or sacrificed alive, and their families would not be enslaved. On the surface, it was warm and affectionate, forming a kind of game rule that everyone had agreed upon. In the hands of a true genius, it was exquisite, like a work of art. His Majesty the Undead Emperor was clearly one of the best. Brando knew this very well. In history, this emperor started from a humble background. She used a mercury staff to ascend to the throne of the empire. Before she became famous, no one knew her origins or where she came from. But with the support of the vampire nobles, even though their support was not firm in the beginning and was filled with two-faced opportunism, she managed to unify the eastern part of the Sea of the Dead Moon in a short 7 years. She tied the 14 dark nobles together and established the land of eternal death and Madara's court. After gaining her own foundation, the queen became unstoppable. She quickly gained the support and recognition of the Dying Moon Temple and was crowned as the Queen of the Silent Death Valley. Then she used the name of the temple to start the First War of the Black Rose. This war was no doubt a stroke of genius. It not only diverted the hatred between the undead lords of Madara from the 7 years of civil war, but also gave the undead emperor a perfect opportunity to eliminate her opponents. In fact, the so-called First War of the Black Roses was actually a war to eliminate her opponents. Cabias and later the Bloodstaff and other traditional undead lords were all killed in this war. What was even more commendable was that the long years of civil war allowed Madara to have an elite army at the beginning of the war. It allowed the undead emperor to achieve her goals and still win. This was very important. Because of this, the war could be transformed into dividends, allowing her followers to benefit from it. This further strengthened the emperor's position in this war. Madara was a special empire without citizens. A few undead lords ruled over the lives of tens of millions of low-level undead. The low-level undead had no intelligence and no political demands. Because of this special reason, it had always been difficult to form a true centralized empire. But the emperor also had the Mercury Staff, and she was very good at using this. She asked the undead to pledge loyalty to the Mercury Staff and not to herself. She used religion as a bond to maintain the pride of the undead lords. She used the legend of the Mercury Staff and the rising of the dying moon to complete the awakening of the Roman Black Rose. This was actually a process of national awakening. And through this process, the emperor, who hid behind the scenes, could easily push the Dying Moon Temple to the front and judge whether the undead lords obeyed her or not. This could be said to be the Otherworld's version of holding the emperor to command the vassals, but the undead emperor cleverly used the tradition of the Dark Kingdom to complete this process beautifully. Until around the year of the sparks in history, Madara had in fact completed the substantial unification of the undead lords. The tradition of the undead lords in the past was completely abolished, and the vigorous development of a new alchemy system also allowed the country to have a completely different way of organization from the past. From then on, it was the arrival of the Black Tide that frightened the whole continent. Her Majesty was undoubtedly an outstanding ruler. Even though she acted arbitrarily and was cold and heartless, she was the most precious treasure that the heavens had given to the Dead Moon Empire. The rumors of Madara's gifted monarch were definitely not just a puppet with a Mercury Staff. Instead, it was the chosen monarch that Martha promised to the undead of Madara. In her era, she was far superior to her peers. The rejuvenated monarchs of Cruz and Fanzan were far inferior to her, not to mention Saint Tassol, who was bound by outdated dogma and could not move forward, and Erwin, who was not worth mentioning in the eyes of the giant Madara. Facing such an existence face to face, it was impossible for Brando not to have a little fear in his heart. Compared to her, the Silver Queen of Cruz was not much different from the Silver Princess of 60 years ago. At most, she had the power of an empire. And this supreme person with a Mercury Staff, even if she was an ordinary person, was definitely the most dangerous kind of existence. But it was precisely because of this fear, as well as the familiarity of her origin and personality, that Brando found a trace of strangeness in the Queen's attitude. At this time, Delphian let go of the reins and came to Brando's side. She whispered a few words in his ear. Before Medisha could frown even more and stare at her with silver eyes, she straightened her body and walked away. Brando glanced at her. The words of the Kurlutzian Prime Minister's daughter coincided with the thoughts in his heart. He looked up at the sky, recalling some information about Lich Daylin in his mind. Daylin was one of the oldest undead lords in the Kingdom of the Dead Moon. In fact, he had seen the Mercury Staff of the previous generation, and had also seen Loki. He was also one of the 3 most powerful liches in Madara. It was for this reason that this fellow had always been disrespectful to Her Majesty the Queen. At the same time, he was also the commander of the Jackdaw fleet. This fleet was formed by a group of necromancers. It was born in the era before the Mercury Staff descended for the second time. Nominally, it belonged to the Dead Moon Temple, but in reality, it was under the command of an organization called the Undead Array. According to legend, the Undead Array was founded by Loki. Because Loki was the most outstanding necromancer in the Kingdom of the Dead Moon for thousands of years, this organization gathered most of the most powerful necromancers and liches in Madara. Its headquarters was in the west of the Sea of the Dead Moon. The necromancers who lived here had built countless towers on that land. Dark Moon sorcerers in fact referred to this group of people. Because of the power of the Undead Array, the Emperor didn't touch them until the end of the First Era, during the Year of the Dragon Shadow. He only let the Lich of Balakarivo, who rose later, keep them in check. It wasn't until the end of the Long Night that Daylin and another Lich King died in the war against the Golden Sea. The Jackdaw fleet was destroyed and the Undead Array was destroyed. Today it seemed like this process was going to be brought forward. Brando had a hunch when he saw the time when the fleet arrived. Daylin obviously didn't care about the Emperor at all. If the Silver Elves hadn't kept their promise, Daylin's fleet wouldn't have come to clean up the mess, but to collect the Emperor's corpse. The Lich's intentions were clear. He was obviously fearless. In fact, the Emperor did have the ability to do so. If it wasn't for the accident in the final war, the Undead Array would have existed for a long time. At least until the middle of the Second Era, Madara wouldn't be able to truly unify. Although Brando suspected that the accident in the final war might not have been an accident. He only needed to look at the Emperor's current intentions to understand. The other party obviously wanted to borrow his hand to get rid of the unlucky Lich King. Brando remained silent. Of course, he didn't want to be used as a tool by the Emperor, but he obviously didn't have a choice. At least, if he wanted to break out, he had to ask the undead army's permission. However, he knew that even if he followed the Emperor's wishes, she might not let him go. It was more likely that she would use him to avenge Duke Daylin. After all, there was no alliance between them. It could only be said that the Emperor was scheming against him. However, he wasn't too worried. The Emperor with the Mercury Staff had given him a big surprise, and he also left a surprise for her. After all, he knew her too well. As Erwin's main enemy, he had long been on guard against the Emperor's ruthlessness. What he was more confused about now was why the Emperor was so confident that he would follow her wishes. If he started with the undead army on the ground, the final result might not be something the undead of Madara could bear. Chapter 1305. Thinking of this, Brando could not help but glance at Bai's shadow. He thought to himself, and what exactly is this woman thinking? She seemed to be eager for him to fight with the Emperor of Madara. Although it was said that she wanted him to get the nature orb and the Mercury Staff, Brando, who had been fooled many times, did not believe in this nonsense. What about the motive? He remembered the scene when he left the elemental barrier, where he saw Bai's soul fusing into the strange arrangement of the automatons floating in the sky dozens of kilometers away from Wonde. Bai's current state obviously had something to do with the situation at that time. Previously, when he obtained power from the elemental orb, he clearly felt that the authority came from the law of Tiamat and Martha. Therefore, he suspected that Bai had seized Martha's authority, because the strange automatons were obviously part of the law of Tiamat. But Haku denied it, although he wasn't sure if he was telling the truth. What? Bai noticed Brando's gaze but did not care too much. Are you still suspicious of me? It's hard not to be suspicious, Brando said while paying attention to the movement of the undead. What made him feel a little strange was that although the undead army had surrounded them, they were not willing to make a move for a long time. This was somewhat different from the character of the Emperor that he was familiar with. In his impression, Bai should be a very decisive person. I can tell you the truth, Bai replied. But you have to answer a question of mine. It's not easy to confirm that the truth provided by the lady is the truth. Brando could not help but mock Bai when he recalled how Bai repeatedly lied to him in the elemental barrier. That's fine. I can first provide you with what I know. If you think that what I said is true, you have to answer my question. Conversely, you can ignore me, right? You're doing this again? Brando could not help but be angry when he recalled the experience in the elemental barrier. Fortunately, the two of them were communicating telepathically. Outsiders could only see the slight change in Brando's expression, but could not hear the content of their conversation. "It's effective, isn't it?" "The choice is up to you," Bai replied without changing his expression. Brando gritted his teeth and didn't say anything. Anyway, he had made up his mind not to answer. No matter what he said, as long as this woman was telling the truth, then it was equivalent to him earning for free. Anyway, she had lied to him more than once in the elemental barrier, so they were even. He silently looked in the direction of the undead army. The Death Moon flag that represented His Majesty the Emperor had returned to the center of the army. If the undead were to make any moves, it should be within the next hour and a half. He extended his hand and summoned Sinna, the Frost Chant, into his hand. When it came to large-scale attacks, the only thing he could rely on was the Water Holy Sword. However, this thing would not be able to differentiate between friend and foe. Back at Fathom Harbor, if it were not for the fact that he was in the witch's dream, he would have blown up half of the harbor. The reason why he had the Silver Elves leave was firstly because he wasn't sure of the Emperor's intentions, and secondly, it was so that he could unleash his full potential. He had made up his mind to teach the other party a lesson so that it would be easier for the next negotiation. Incersta was still frowning at the side. Brando glanced at this guy and couldn't help but feel proud. He knew very well that this future star of Madara's family had a close relationship with the Queen, so he deliberately mentioned the other party's previous promise so that he would have no time to think about other things. Otherwise, with this guy's intelligence, if he were to guess his thoughts and seize the opportunity to remind the Emperor, then he would be completely done for. Fortunately, with the advantage of foresight, he once again took the initiative in front of this genius of Madara. Tarkus seemed to have noticed something, but interestingly this vampire did not point it out. Bai saw that Brando didn't say anything, as if she didn't care what he was thinking. She said to herself, "My lord, do you want to know what that person's plan is?" Brando looked at Medicia's sister with a little disdain. "Her Majesty wants me to help her deal with the undead. Maybe she wants to kill two birds with one stone." "Miss Bai, you're not going to use this information to exchange with me, are you?" "Of course not, this is just a bonus. Aren't you curious about what she's going to do?" "I can guess that she's the one who planted people in the undead fleet," Brando sneered, "but I won't let the Emperor down. I'll give her the biggest surprise." "Angering her won't do you any good, Count. I have to remind you." Bai replied with a straight face. "What?" "Because of the Mercury staff." Brando was silent for a moment and shook his head. "That's another matter. I don't plan to talk about it with her for the time being, but I will never show weakness in front of the Emperor. I know her style, or Erwin will never have a day of peace." "You know her very well," Bai said curiously. "You seem to be very interested in the undead." "There's an old saying in the Nine Phoenix," Brando replied. "You're saying that no one is allowed to sleep beside the bed?" "I've been to the Nine Phoenix before, so I know a little about the customs there. But as Erwin's subject, I think you're overreacting." "I don't want to talk about this, Miss Bai. You should be answering me, not the other way around, right?" Bai raised her head and looked at him. "Then what do you want to ask?" Brando was about to answer, but at that moment, flags were raised in the undead army, and the crystal towers for communication lit up again. A green net of light appeared in the darkness, and the undead army was immediately filled with dots of green light. This was undoubtedly the signal to attack. But to everyone's surprise, it wasn't the undead army on the ground that made the first move, but the Jackdaw fleet in the sky. Suddenly, a flash of light flashed through the dark fleet. One of the battleships took the lead and fired its cannons. The flash of magic crossed a few thousand meters and arrived above Brendel and the others in an instant. However, the ray of light did not hit Brendel and the others. Instead, it was blocked by a transparent barrier far away from them. The barrier deformed slightly under the impact of the ray of light, but it returned to its original state in an instant. This time it wasn't just Brando's people who were shocked. Even the undead lords were shocked. In their minds, Dai Lin, the Lich King, wasn't as loyal to the ruler with the Mercury staff as they thought. The undead lords weren't fools. They immediately looked at their cold and silent queen, and more or less had some guesses in their hearts. But to the person involved in this incident, the Lich King Dai Lin wasn't as angry as they thought. Although he was more or less unhappy that his subordinates acted without permission, the undead fleet wasn't his private property. As mentioned earlier, this fleet was formed by a group of necromancers and liches. Although Dai Lin was its commander in name, most of the time the fleet did what they wanted. Rather than saying that this was a well-organized fleet, it was better to say that it was a large pirate fleet. So when the corvette opened fire, Dai Lin, who was observing the situation on the battlefield through the crystal ball, was a little unhappy. But he quickly suppressed his dissatisfaction and ordered the fleet to open fire. He could delay the time for the fleet to enter the battlefield, but he couldn't openly disobey the Mercury Staff's orders. Although he was arrogant, he understood that the woman now had half of the forces in the Sea of the Dead Moon. She was afraid of the undead, but that didn't mean that she could ignore her dignity and be challenged. Dai Lin was demonstrating to the central government of the empire because of the blood staff, but he also understood that this demonstration couldn't be overdone. As for attacking a small group of humans, Dai Lin would never dream of how dangerous it would be. What kind of joke was that? That group of humans that he had surrounded had no more than 100 or so people at most. Even if every one of them was a peak law expert, they would not pose any threat to his fleet. No matter what, this was still a main force of the fleet. As for the possibility that the 100 or so people were all supreme beings, Dai Lin didn't even consider it. After all, he was a lich, not a brainless zombie. It had to be said that the Lich King had at least guessed the beginning, but it was a pity that he didn't guess the end. If the Lich King of Los Art knew that he had entered the battlefield too late and missed out on something important, perhaps he would be more careful with his orders now. When the undead fleet was enveloped in a dazzling magic light, the woman with the Mercury staff raised her head. Her pitch-black eyes happened to reflect this dazzling scene. She couldn't help but shake her head. Brando was no longer shaking his head. In fact, he was already cursing in his heart. It wasn't that he didn't expect the woman to plant people in the Jackdaw fleet. In fact, when the corvette opened fire, it was all within his calculations. That was why he had set up defenses early and blocked the magic attack dozens of meters away. But never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined that the legendary Lich King would be so stupid. When he saw the entire Jackdaw fleet firing in unison, the Lich King felt like he was going to kill someone. No matter how scattered the Jackdaw fleet was, it was still a main force. When they started firing, Brando wasn't confident that he could take on an entire fleet while attacking the undead below. Right now he only had one choice. He had to immediately attack the Jackdaw fleet and make them shut up. After all, if they didn't shut up he would be fine, but the people around him would be. Chapter 1306. Brendel did not intend to make an example out of Dai Lin, but there was nothing he could do if Dai Lin wanted to die. He scolded him in his heart for being an idiot and raised the frost chant in his hand. After Sinnoh was recast in the shallow sea, the blade was longer than before, making it look like a thin sword. There was a wavy, cage-like gauntlet under the blade. Brando held it in his hand, and a sapphire embedded in the gauntlet emitted a faint blue light like water ripples. 3 light blue halos opened from the blade, 2 at the front and 1 at the back. The halos expanded to a radius of about 1 meter in an instant. They rotated as if they were 3 light gates. Marrow? The intertwined silver net in front of them was still resisting the streaks of flames that fell from the sky. The shells of the undead fleet fell on it like raindrops. But the moment Sinnoh shouted the activation spell, a blue beam of light suddenly appeared. It pierced through the net of light and went against the magic and artillery of the undead fleet, piercing into the dark night sky. The light was so bright that it seemed to be able to light up the dark night of the Finhodo Strait. It also lit up every pair of eyes on the battlefield. Countless people subconsciously turned to look at it. Adney and the knight only felt a strong wind blowing past their cheeks. The air and dust cloud raised by the blue beam of light blew everyone's hair up and brushed their cheeks. At that moment, time seemed to have stopped. Dai Lin was in the middle of a conversation with his apprentices, reminding them to be careful and not give the queen any information that could be used against her. If that was the case, she would, as always, viciously threaten these undead wizard apprentices with no status, saying that she would extract their souls and throw them into the crystal tower. But at that moment, someone seemed to be stunned and looked out of the porthole. The old lich turned around and almost bounced off his chair. The crystal ball was knocked off the table and rolled to the ground. In the depths of the old lich's dark eye sockets, the soul fire shrunk to a point. He slightly opened his jaw made of white bones, and did not even notice that the scepter that represented the fleet commander had loosened from between his pale fingers. If his eyeballs had not decayed, the bluest light would have been reflected in them. Frostchant Sinnoh. She was the legendary winter queen of the Jernords. Legend said that when she came, everything was frozen and the whole world was covered in snow. When she was angry, the world was turned into powder in the extreme cold. She was the goddess of the north wind, representing the harshness of winter and the respect of mortals to nature. The shallow sea sacred sword was the manifestation of the goddess will. Everything was dead, the winter of the world. Every holy sword had a unique skill, and Xena's skill, heat death, was enough to explain everything. It was the end of a universe. What shot out from Sinnoh was a blue beam of light formed by countless rays of light that surrounded each other. It rushed toward the fleet of the undead. Wherever it passed, even the air seemed to be frozen. The elements and laws that made up the air directly turned into powder and fell down. In this strait, before winter, there was heavy snow. The snowflakes were very fine, like gray dust, as if they were corpses. They were the corpses of laws and elements. The black magic and the cannonballs that the undead fleet shot out seemed to be weathered. When the beam of light passed between them, it turned into colorful dust and disappeared with the wind. On the undead fleet, the skeleton sailors were cutting the shackles on the limbs of the bone dragons so that they could take off from the deck. The ice dragons roared and spread their wings. The first batch had already left the ship and was circling in the sky, ready to dive down. But the beam of light passed between them. There was no frozen scene. More than 20 ice dragons exploded like pieces. Crystal dust swirled in the sky, forming a cloud of dust. However, it happened so fast that the sailors on the ship had no time to react. The beam of light had already pierced through the cloud of dust. It swept past the corvette, Shadow Bone first. The sailors on the deck were instantly vaporized, and the wooden planks were frozen and cracked. The 47-meter-long warship was cut into two halves. The wooden planks, the frozen sails, and the parts covered in frost fell from the sky like rain. The moment the beam of light passed through, the Jackdaw fleet lost a third of their warships, including their only first-class battleship, the Treasure of the Undead. It was also Dalen's ship. This Lemeter Lich King was hit in the middle of the ship's deck. The beam of light pierced through its abdomen. It was split in two and the rest turned into powder. Its skull flew out and hit a famous painting in the captain's cabin, then fell to the floor. The crimson light in its eye sockets flickered, then disappeared unwillingly. The shallow sea sword. It really is you. The Queen of Madara clenched the mercury staff in her hand. Her tone was colder, and her attitude seemed to be more resolute. Dalen's ship turned into powder in midair. All the undead lords were shocked speechless. They had never seen such terrifying power. The pressure from the shallow sea sword almost made them tremble from the depths of their souls. But Brando's attack was not over. Cinna's power shocked him. This was indeed the holy relic that sabers used to fight against an army. After it became complete, its power was close to the power that Milos had displayed. It was the power of God. But Brando felt that he was still unable to control this power. Even if Tiamat's authority was still on him and he was still in the Sage Realm, it was still the same. He furrowed his brows and once again increased the output of his power. This time, Cinna no longer spewed out a beam of light, but a cone-shaped storm. After it crossed more than 10 miles, it directly enveloped the entire undead fleet. Half of the sky could be said to be filled with azure brilliance. A light flashed in the eyes of the Queen of Madara. She wanted to use Brando to kill Dalen, but this did not mean that she would allow Brando to destroy the undead fleet. It was already the wealth of the Empire. She did not even think about it and raised the mercury staff in her hand. It was the master of the dark will. It was often said that the mercury staff could open the door to the underworld. But in his previous life, Brando rarely saw the Queen of Madara display the true power of the mercury staff, even in front of the Madara players. She was a skillful ruler, but there was little information about her being a powerful necromancer. Of course, Brando guessed that her strength would not be that low. She should at least be in the Supreme Realm. After all, Madara was not an empire with a clear heritage like Cruz, and there was also the Holy Cathedral backing the throne. In this chaotic world, the only thing one could rely on was one's own strength. The facts proved his guess. When the woman raised the mercury staff in her hand, he felt that he had lost contact with the prime material plane. To be more precise, he felt that he had arrived in a completely dark world. He was only stunned for a moment before he realized where he was. This was the Sea of Magic. Although there was nothing around him, he could feel the surging magic power. It was just that this power was filled with negative emotions such as malice, coldness, and frenzy. In this world, only one kind of power had such attributes, and that was the dark magic. It was also the predecessor of the dark element. Brando raised his head and saw Her Majesty not far in front of him. She was holding the mercury staff, and the aura of power overflowing from her body was at the peak of the Supreme Realm. But this made him feel a little strange. Her Majesty the Queen should have understood that at this moment, his power was already at the level of a sage, not to mention that he also had a great killing machine like Cinna. She had decisively attacked him, and her backup plan was to pull him into this world created by the mercury staff to fight him one-on-one? This was not very wise, was it? And it was not in line with her personality. But Brando immediately understood that he was wrong. He saw that the Supreme One of Madara only looked at him coldly, and her wavy black hair moved without wind. He was shocked to find that she was absorbing the majestic magic in the surrounding sea of magic. Absorbing the dark magic? Brando almost thought that he had sensed wrongly. Even a witch would not dare to use the dark magic directly, unless she wanted to immediately become a lunatic. But it turned out that Her Majesty did not become a lunatic, and there was a faint trace of gold in her black eyes. Her strength rose all the way from the peak of the supreme realm, and in the blink of an eye, she had crossed the threshold of the sage. But this was not the end. Brando clearly felt that her blood and aura were purifying, all the way from iron, silver, and all the way to gold before it stopped. God. Brando was completely stunned. For the first time in this world, he felt that everything he was familiar with had fallen into an unreasonable state, as if his original worldview had collapsed. He had never heard of anyone who could directly absorb the dark magic for their own use. Of course, excluding the bastards under Dusk. If all mortals had such power, then they would not have to fight against Dusk. Dusk itself was already a part of the whole world. What was this woman? Or was this the power of the Mercury staff? But Brando immediately shook his head and subconsciously rejected this guess. The Mercury staff itself was only a part of the incomplete Holy Sword Judgment. Even the Black Pearl and Holy Sword Judgment did not have such power, let alone the Mercury staff. Chapter 1307. Brando believed that the Mercury staff only opened the door to this world. This kind of power was similar to the extreme planes, but the power of the Supreme Realm was a simulation of the law, while the power of the Mercury staff directly projected the sea of magic into the prime material plane. Compared to the level of the law, the latter was obviously higher. As for the absorption of the dark magic, it was obviously the power of this woman herself. But why did she have such power? Brando frowned and suddenly felt a little tricky. What was the concept of a golden body? It was definitely not something he could figure out. When he was at his strongest in history, he was just a pseudo-silver great warrior. He was not even worth a finger in front of the Dragon King Owen Los. And now, Her Majesty the Emperor of Madara had the power of Owen Los. No wonder the other party was so fearless. That was not easy to deal with. But at this time, a flash of lightning suddenly flashed in Brando's mind. He suddenly remembered that there was someone who could directly absorb the dark magic for her own use. The legendary 13th Moon Witch, the Witch of the Black Moon. Many people in history believed that the 13th moon did not exist, so its witch should also not exist. But there was also a saying that the Witch of the Black Moon was the witch with the most special inheritance. She was the harbinger, the one who brought about the destruction of the world. She was a witch and had the bloodline of the twilight, so she could directly use the dark magic. This news was not very reliable in his previous life, but in this life, Brando had already known the existence of the Witch of the Black Moon, so he subconsciously blurted out, "You are a Witch of the Black Moon? Her Majesty the Emperor of Madara is a witch?" The woman's face showed some surprise for the first time, but she did not answer, and the look on her face quickly became cold again. It was just a momentary change of expression. In this world where everything was quiet and the whole world was dark, and only the two of them existed in this world, it was really difficult to escape Brando's observation. "What is your real name, Your Majesty?" Every witch had a real name, just like Babasha and Sugar Pot. They were good at disguising themselves, but in front of the people they were loyal to, they often showed their real names. Of course, Brando did not expect any loyalty, but he knew that the other party would not refuse to answer his question. This was because he possessed the inheritance of the Dark Dragon. Sure enough, the queen frowned, but she still spoke. However, the words that came out of her mouth left Brando dumbfounded. "Don't think that I will do anything just because you obtained a part of my father's inheritance. My father's inheritance has no binding effect on the 13th moon, and the Dark Dragon isn't my master. The witches of the Black Moon are the most unique existences in this world. I'm only here to die." However, she raised her head and looked at Brando as she replied, "But there's nothing wrong with telling you my name. My real name is Sophie Yuya." You are Odin's daughter? Why? But Brando suddenly understood. As the true descendant of Odin and the Witch Empress, where did the other party's identity as a Black Moon Witch come from? The witch lineage originally existed by stealing the power of Dusk. It was said that the first generation of witches was created by the bloodline of Dusk. It was not strange that the Witch Empress and her descendants had the bloodline of the Dusk Dragon. However, what made him feel strange was why the Witch Empress would give her inheritance to the Roman and give the inheritance of the Black Moon to her daughter. Logically speaking, shouldn't it be the other way around? Moreover, the name Sophie Yuya made him slightly stunned. He felt that he had heard this name somewhere before. "You look very strange. Your little lover and I are on opposite sides. I don't have any blood relations with her, but in theory she should call me sister. Wait, in theory the Roman should be older than you, right? Shut up. The queen replied indifferently, I shouldn't have said so much to a dead person, but seeing that you have my father's inheritance, I reluctantly let you die with understanding. Martha, Echius, and the witches have already agreed on everything. Do you think you are the destined one? But there is not only one king in this world. As she spoke, several pairs of light wings appeared behind her. They were exactly the same as Brando's own light wings, but the color was completely opposite. The light wings behind the queen were actually pitch black. Only one person can decide the fate of this world. We don't have much time left. She sent you to me for nothing. You don't have to blame her. That was my order. That woman is really up to no good. Brando couldn't help but curse. Are you going to kill me? He asked. You can kill me too. The queen replied, if you can do it, I know you have the Haoran Gaia, the blade of golden flames, the shallow sea sword, and even the approval of judgment. If you think you can do it, you can try. Brando couldn't help but curse in his heart. It would be strange if he could do it. Not to mention that he now had the power of several holy swords, even if it was doubled, so what? He now had the power of the sage domain, and this queen was obviously in existence with a golden body. How could he fight? He saw the woman raise the mercury staff in her hand and immediately shouted, Wait! Are you trying to stall for time? No, I have a question. You said that only one person can decide the fate of the world? As Brando asked this question, his mind was spinning rapidly. He was not a fool. He knew that this queen's power obviously couldn't last forever. Otherwise, why would she need to use tricks in history? She could suppress all the voices of opposition in the Dead Moon Empire with her power alone. In the face of absolute power, tricks were just a joke. But she didn't. In fact, not only did this queen not do that in history, she even rarely displayed such power in front of people. At least, she didn't show it in front of living people, nor did she show it in front of players. Otherwise, there would be news about it. This meant that there was a limit to her power. But he still hadn't found out where this limit was, so he still needed time. That was why he asked this question without thinking. The queen glanced at him and replied without changing her expression. The person who obtains the key can decide the fate of this world. Are you immortal, your majesty? Brando saw her expression and his heart sank. He knew that this queen was also a genius, so it was unlikely that she didn't see his plan to stall for time. But she was so calm that it could only mean that her power didn't seem to have a time limit in this world. Then he could only start from another angle. That would be even more troublesome. Mortal? Martha gave power to the mortals, Brando replied casually. But in the end, it's still up to existences like us to decide the fate of the world. What's the difference between this and when the Truth Parliament still existed? He paused and continued, according to the Bugas, the power level of order that we represent is far higher than the world itself. As long as this order of the past exists, the war with the Twilight will never stop. What can we do? Just like the past? But the power of mortals is declining, and one day we will even lose our inheritance. Is this the so-called Age of Mortals? The queen sneered. Do you really believe in the Age of Mortals? What do you mean? Brando frowned, even his thoughts were interrupted. That's just a complete lie. Do you really believe that the gods have left this world? She looked at Brando with her black eyes, full of contempt. No, they just lost their power or died. Martha can't do anything about it. Otherwise, why do you think she made such an agreement with Echius? What agreement? Brando's heart was filled with shock. You don't know? The queen frowned as if hesitating to speak, but she finally replied, Martha promised Echius that as long as she betrayed the Twilight, she would be given enough authority to become the ruler of Tiamta. In other words, she would replace Martha as the new king of the gods in this world. That's impossible. Nothing is impossible. Lady Martha has also lost her power. She has to replace Echius. Echius is sleeping in this world to avoid the eyes and ears of the Twilight Dragon and accept the transformation of the law of Tiamat. She wants to become the ruler of this world, so naturally she can give up everything. But also seize this opportunity to seize the authority of the law of Tiamat. Speaking of which, I have to thank you for bringing her to that place. Although I don't understand what she's planning to do, the price I gave her is very simple, and that is to bring you here. Brando suppressed the shock in his heart and asked with difficulty, so, the so-called Age of Mortals is actually a lie to cover up the replacement of the old and new worlds. You can understand it that way. What about you? What is your purpose, your majesty? Me? The queen replied, of course, to become the ruler of the world. I have the talent laurel that Echius, the new Martha, has given me. I have the blessings of the 7 holy swords. I will become the true ruler of the next era. Wherever I look, it will be the territory of my kingdom." Brando silently closed his eyes. He gently shook his head. On the battlefield of Fenhodos, Bai's shadow was looking up. Her eyes reflected the shining river of stars in the night sky. "Sister, what did you do to Sir Monarch?" Medisa asked coldly from not too far away from her. The eldest princess of the Silver Elves turned around and glanced at her younger sister. "You don't understand, Medisha," she replied faintly. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. Sometimes I think that maybe it would be better for you if I didn't make this choice. Medisha, tell me, am I right or am I wrong?" Chapter 1308. The dark world was silent. The queen noticed Brando's movements and said, "What, you don't believe me?" Brando didn't answer. The memory in his heart flashed one by one. It was the most flawless light in the darkness, as pure as fire, as if it could contain everything. The gentle voice spoke so, it was enough to warm people's hearts. "Child, I will give you wings of light so that you can be king. One day I will be honored because of you, but how can I honor you, mother?" Brando raised his head and opened his eyes. The rainbow ring in his pupils was completely covered by a layer of light golden light, shining in the darkness. In the depths of his eyes, there seemed to be a bright flame burning. Why did the wand exist? Who gave the world the first ray of light? She was the mother of all living things, giving the world everything it should have: life, wisdom, civilization, and kindness. She had shown her children a path of incomparable brilliance. For thousands of years, countless people had been blessed and cared for by her. Even though they had failed time and time again, what shone like the spear of the azure night was their ideals and hope. Ideals and hope, they were only honored because of their tenacity and unyielding. We give her the honor. Because one day children will leave their mother's arms. They will grow up and be independent. They will take the crown from their mother's hands and become the masters of the world. That day. Only then could it be called honor. This was the dream of mortals. But it was also the dream of Martha. Brando shook his head. How could he be shaken? The spears of the Kurlets still shone brightly, and the people of Aween gradually regained their faith. The undead fought side by side with their ancestors on this land, and after 1,000 years, the war song of the Silver Elves once again reverberated across this land. No one gave up their faith. The fire of civilization was not extinguished because of this. "Your Majesty, why do you have to lie?" He sighed softly. The queen with the mercury staff was stunned. She looked at the man with a strange look. There was pity and disappointment in her eyes, but there was also a trace of appreciation. Then it turned into a distant look. "Do you really think so?" "Actually, I only have one question. How did the fire of the gods extinguish?" The queen remained silent. There was silence in the darkness. No one could answer this question, and no one would answer this question because the answer was formless and naturally echoed in this dark world. They created this world and gave it everything. One day they left. But hope was passed down from generation to generation. After 6 eras they became the proudest children of the gods. Their older brothers, the Golden Sages and the Silver Guardians, gave everything to them. They were the last generation of this world, the Iron People. And that was where its hope lay. Then what is the age of mortals? Perhaps he still couldn't see the road ahead, but at least he had an answer in his heart. Brando believed that this was his own heart, and also everything that Martha had given him. One day he might get the ultimate answer. But before that, at least he didn't have to wonder anymore. He looked at the queen in front of him and suddenly felt grateful. The questions that had been buried in his heart disappeared without a trace. A sword appeared behind Brendel's back. Like the rising sun, the sword was burning with raging flames, and the golden veins climbed up along the dark blade. That was an unyielding resistance, the origin of the history of the Erewhon and Cruz people. Then there were 4 swords that appeared one after another. The last one was the judgment. When the dark holy sword appeared behind Brando, it immediately summoned the mercury staff. The queen lowered her head and looked at the restless mercury staff in her hand with a complicated expression. "I didn't completely lie to you," the queen sighed. "Unfortunately, I hope you won't regret your choice at this moment in the future. But I'm curious, I thought I was that person." Brando stared at her. "I once met someone, she was more determined than you, her thoughts were noble, but she fell because of it. But in your eyes, I don't see a trace of madness." Hearing this, the queen's dark eyes flashed, and she gently put down the mercury staff in her hand. "You said that I'm not suitable for acting, and it seems that you're right. But as the blessed of the Black Moon, you must abandon your emotions, or the dark emotions will take advantage of it. Are you really the witch of the 13th moon? The queen nodded. Except for the last words, I didn't lie to you too much. In fact, I really wanted to kill you because I wanted to fulfill my father's wish. Are you talking about Odin? She shook her head as if unwilling to talk about it. You were talking about the Silver Queen, right? I'm sorry about her death. Gwendolyn was too extreme and she paid the price for it. Brando was a little surprised. He already knew that the Dragon Queen and Fuchsia were related by blood, and Fuchsia and Odin were lovers. Speaking of which, Gwendolyn was really the queen's sister. But what the hell? He felt that everything was a mess. The queen raised the Mercury staff in her hand. This is everything you want. Loki's staff is the projection of dark magic in the present world. It is the reflection of negative emotions in people's hearts. But a real world cannot be without a dark side. Good and evil, light and darkness, they are all part of it. Annihilation and the value of its existence is to tell the world that our values are diverse. They argue with each other endlessly, but only then can we find the most correct path. Brando looked around, taking in the whole dark world. Although he had expected it, he still understood at this moment. So, all of this is an illusion created by the Mercury staff, and this is its power? The queen shook her head. It is not an illusion, but what you are most afraid to see in your heart, and the darkest side of your heart. If you don't see your heart clearly and examine your weakness, you will be swallowed up by arrogance and darkness. This is the meaning of Loki's staff. When she finished her sentence, Yi Zichen nodded. The dark world around them seemed to become brighter. Although it was still blurry, at least the darkness had disintegrated into fragments and was gradually fading. The queen's power was also rapidly weakening, from the peak of the golden body to the level of the middle of the supreme realm. Everything before was like a dream. But her ultimate power did not disperse, still isolating the two of them from the main material plane. Brando knew that this was the time she left for him. He asked, Ekis really wants to become Martha? He remembered the conversation between Timmy's and Ko Hua outside the elemental barrier, which seemed to have vaguely mentioned this matter. This is true, but it is not without restrictions for her. Lady Martha has already arranged everything, and the witches are only a part of this plan. The queen replied, But you don't need to know this. I only hope that you can stick to your own choice. Not everyone can take something from me, but this is the will of the Mercury staff and I hope that you can go further. What do you mean? Brando was slightly stunned. But he saw that the queen's expression had returned to coldness and she said coldly, Before taking this step, I have one last question. Brando, do you understand the responsibility that your choice represents? I don't quite understand. The queen looked at him and silently said something, but her voice was very soft. She let go of her hand, and the Mercury staff flew out of her hand, drawing an arc as it flew towards him. Brando vaguely heard the sentence, I hope you don't regret it. Then he stretched out his hand and took the Mercury staff. The world seemed to be stretched at that moment, and the colorful light rapidly faded from all directions. When the colors faded, it was a dark night. Dai Lin's warship that had turned into powder and fell from the sky, the black undead army, by with a complicated expression and the angry elven princess, as well as Adney and her knight. They were all back in his field of vision. The only difference was, he held the Mercury staff in his hand. Time froze here. In the dark space, hundreds of billions of dark golden constructs were suspended. They crisscrossed with each other, forming a huge net that densely covered the sky of Wond. This was a silent and completely quiet world. Above the atmosphere that emitted fluorescent light, in the void, some crystal fragments would occasionally float past. Streaks of white light flashed past the constructs, and when they continued to brighten, they formed several light belts that were thousands of miles long. A pair of quiet eyes stared at the light belts. Two other voices were arguing in her ears. One of the voices belonged to a giant wolf. It stood majestically in the void, with the world wall that covered the entire sky as the background. Its silver eyes coldly stared at Bai, who was suspended in front of it. The small elf was not even as big as the tip of its nose. Which, you brought me here from the loop of trade winds just to buy time? Ekis asked. Sophie answered calmly. Ekis, you weren't so impatient in the past. This isn't impatience, it's uneasiness. Ekis shook his head. The more you understand, the more afraid you will be of this world. I don't know what you're thinking, but unlike you, I don't believe in luck. That's not luck, Bai suddenly said. Ekis, are you going to break your promise? Chapter 1309. After Haku spoke, there was a long period of silence in the empty space. After a long while, the silver wolf raised her head again. She looked at the silhouette of the silver elf elder princess with an indifferent gaze. The ladders will permeated the entire space, but she did not care. Little one, that's the rule of your game. Ekis shook his head. His silver mane swayed gently. Have you seen the ultimate mystery of the universe? Compared to all the truths in this world, your lives are too short. It's as if in a moment of my thought, you have already declined generation after generation. After saying that, the elegant creature raised her head proudly. So, with your short lives, you can't understand its meaning. It's a moment of the universe, but it's also the eternity of all things. Its birth is older than everything you know, even before the birth of consciousness in the universe itself. It doesn't bring destruction but new life. I've seen many people struggling to survive until now, but the end result is the same. Everyone knows how powerful it is. But in the end you still betrayed it, didn't you? Haku sneered. That's the charm of all of this. Ekis's eyes flashed with a gentle light. Birth and destruction are never constant. Because your vision is too short-sighted, you can only see the moment in front of you. The crystallizers and the no race, the locusts and my people are just the will that it produced in a moment. Just like the dreams of mortals, we're just a part of this world and it's full of variables. Your war, my betrayal, it doesn't hurt at all. Your resistance is just like a part of this world. Can you hurt time itself? No. Whether you do evil or good, whether you live or die, the river of time will always move forward. Even if all things cease to exist, time will still flow. That's the great power. Haku frowned. I hate your nihilistic thinking. As I said, this isn't nothingness. It's only because your lives are too short that you feel this kind of sorrow. In fact, even your short lives and some of your laughable actions are meaningful in my eyes. Even to it is meaningful, replied Ekis. It is only that you and I that have a different definition of the meaning. Existence is meaning, Sophie, who had been quietly watching Wond, suddenly said. She turned her head. The witch's face was completely different from the Queen of Madara, but her eyes were similar. They were both indifferent and quiet. There's no need to argue. What do you want? Authority, Ekis replied. I will immediately reactivate this world. This is your only chance. In the next era, with the help of the new gods, you will obtain even more opportunities. But this time it's too late. When it descends, you will no longer have the slightest chance of victory. That's impossible. Bai rejected flatly. That's possible, replied Sophie quietly. I agree to your request. Your Majesty. Haku turned his head and looked at her. 3 existences floated in the void. 2 people and a wolf. The gods and the gods, in the past and the future, have always controlled the fate of this world. There is no difference, replied Sophie. But she is Ekis, the new god of Wond. So what? She turned her head and looked at Haku's shadow. It is the world that chooses its fate, not us who decides the future of the mortals. This is not charity, Haku. Very few people understood what had happened in the instant before that. But at least they could be sure that the Queen of the Undead opened the extreme plane and pulled Brando in. Although it only lasted for a few seconds, the extreme plane disappeared in a few seconds, and both of them returned to the world unscathed. Brando raised his hand high, still maintaining the posture of taking the Mercury staff from the air. The restless Insursta was the first to see this scene. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he almost cried out involuntarily. But although he did not shout out in the end, his actions inevitably attracted the attention of others. Adney and a few of the 9 phoenixes were fine, but Medisha, Blank and Delphian were stunned at the first moment. They looked at the Mercury staff in Brando's hand with a look of extreme disbelief. In fact, Brando himself was a little dumbfounded. He did not expect that the Queen would disperse the extreme plane in such a situation. What was she trying to do? The commotion at the front quickly spread to the liches and liches behind the undead army. When the apprentice necromancers saw the Mercury staff in Brando's hand, they all looked back with an expression of disbelief. The undead lords also turned their heads one by one. Their gazes were all gathered in the direction of Her Majesty the Queen. Almost no one dared to believe that the Mercury staff would be lost because of this. They thought that it was nothing more than a trick played by humans, but this trick was too absurd, so absurd that it could be seen through with a poke. But the question was, how could there be such a stupid person who would think of playing such a trick in front of so many people? In their minds, these humans were clearly not such stupid people. The undead lords were actually a little uncertain. And when they saw that Her Majesty the Queen's hand was empty, this kind of panic spread uncontrollably. Your Majesty, Isaac's face was pale, so pale that one could tell at a glance that he was a necromancer. Large beads of sweat seeped out of his forehead, and he stuttered as he asked, so nervous that it was as if he would suddenly die from arrhythmia in the next moment. But the queen did not answer him. Her face was full of shock, and she trembled as she looked at Brando, as if something unbelievable had happened. Brando saw this woman's expression from afar, and couldn't help but curse in his heart. What happened to saying that I'm not suitable for acting? What happened to the witches of the Black Moon having to abandon all emotions? What happened to the basic trust between humans? Well, he meant the basic trust between humans and the undead? Can't you just play around like this? He couldn't help but call himself an idiot in his heart. He clearly knew that she was a famous movie queen in history, and the best actress at the Oscars, but he actually believed her when she said that. What was stupidity? This was stupidity. But what Brando didn't understand the most was what this woman was after. If she wanted to give him the Mercury staff and continue to maintain her ruling position, then the best choice would be to choose a private transaction, and then create a fake that could be passed off as the real thing. Anyway, no one would really come to verify the authenticity of the Mercury staff. However, the fact that she had thrown the Mercury staff to him and put on such a pose made him feel a little puzzled. If she said that it was to frame him, the price she had to pay was a little too high. Moreover, it would affect her own prestige, which was purely superfluous. But other than that, he couldn't think of any other reason. Unless this queen was a two-faced person, and simply wanted to toy with him. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but the more Brando thought about it, the more likely it was. He didn't have time to think about this question, but he heard the queen shout, "Catch him, the Mercury staff is on his scalp." Fuck. The undead army was in chaos in an instant. It was definitely not because they were mobilized, but because they were in a real mess. What did the Mercury staff mean to Madara? Throne? Power? Or was it a supreme status? Brando didn't know. But at least he understood that it was the highest belief and spiritual sustenance of the entire Dead Moon Empire. So every undead on the front line went completely crazy. As long as they had the slightest bit of intelligence, they wouldn't let the Mercury staff fall into the hands of a human. Without waiting for the undead lords behind to give orders, the undead wizard apprentices, liches on the front line had already screamed out orders. There was no coordination at all. All the undead just rushed over in a rush. Everyone was shocked, including Medisha and the always optimistic Miss Hippamera. To their small team, this undead army was definitely more terrifying than before. The key was that in the chaos, the undead were trampling on each other, let alone the enemies. How could they break through? But just when everyone was at their wits' end, a sacred sword burning with raging flames rose up from the chaos. Odorfice emitted such a bright light in the night that everyone couldn't help but raise their heads in that direction. The burning sacred light almost instantly burned the eyes of thousands of undead, piercing into their soul fire from the depths of their eye sockets. The long-awaited pain caused them to scream in pain, and some of the low-level undead even spontaneously combusted in an instant. The second sword to rise was the Shallow Sea Sword. The pale blue light flickered like ripples, spreading out in all directions. The undead that it touched were immediately frozen into ice cubes. Everything within 1,000 meters was sealed in ice. The third sword was the Haoran Gaia. The fourth sword was the Firmament. When the fifth holy sword rose, Brendel suddenly felt a strong force in his hand, and the Mercury staff flew out of his hand. He looked up and saw a black shadow shooting towards the holy sword of annihilation. The fifth sword. In midair, Freya snorted, her golden eyes flashing slightly, 2 more. At this moment, boundless pressure descended from the sky. P.S. Begging for votes. Chapter 13:11. When the fifth sacred sword rose into the sky, the undead in the front row suddenly stopped. The necromancers at the back were still anxiously urging the skeleton soldiers to move forward because their vision was blocked. The undead in the front and back rows collided with each other, and for a moment the battlefield was in chaos. Until someone let out a hoarse scream. Sacred sword annihilation. Fall back, fall back. There was no need for the intelligent undead commanders to give orders. The tireless and fearless low-level undead seemed to be dominated by uneasiness for the first time. The soul fire in their sunken eye sockets flickered violently. The huge crusader executioners at the front row had begun to fall back. These skeletal behemoths, which were 15 or 16 feet tall, unreasonably crashed into the group of skeleton soldiers and archers at the back row. Their huge shins were like battering rams, sweeping the fragile undead down. Then, the mid-level necromancers of Madara were horrified to find that they had lost contact with the low-level necromancers and the skeletons. They were shocked to see the sea of skeletons on the battlefield begin to retreat. The scene was even more terrifying and destructive than the scene of the human army retreating that they were familiar with, because there were more of them. The necromancers and vampires at the back row were the first to be scattered. The noble vampire knights, who had to maintain their elegance on the battlefield, had no choice but to give up their elegance at this moment. They turned into bats and flew away from the battlefield. Although they could barely suppress the uneasiness and fear in their hearts, they could not find a leader in the chaos. They could only scatter and fly in the direction of Her Majesty. Then the Black Knight was also affected. The noble dark nobles from the central region of the Sea of the Dying Moon were born in various noble families and territories. They were the proudest army of the undead army. Generally speaking, they were also the strongest in terms of combat power. They were not inferior to the liches and bone dragons. However, the Black Knight's role on the battlefield came from the charge of the Heavy Knights. Thanks to the characteristics of the undead, they were the only cavalry in the world that could charge like a wall. Hence, they were known as the Romans' Iron Curtain. But at this moment, this iron wall did not play any role in the face of thousands of retreating skeleton soldiers. Just like the human knights, these cold knights who cherished their feathers also made the right choice at the first moment. They waved the long sabers in their hands and slowly retreated with their retainers and attendants. When the Black Knight retreated, it basically announced the collapse of the undead line. North of the Strait of Finhodos, the commander of the Pale Knights, Duke Barbarossa, saw this scene from the periphery of the battlefield. His ghost-like face was full of worry. He looked up at the odd-shaped giant sword in the air. When the adjutant of the Necromancer Lord, who was also a high-grade necromancer, came to inquire him, the undead duke did not hesitate to order to retreat. Annihilation, the destruction of all things. Your Majesty. What should we do? Isaac's mouth was agape. Although he was a human, the muscles on his bald head were loose and pale. His eyes were sunken and his limbs were withered, making him look more like a skeleton than a skeleton. He did not expect the queen to answer his question. The Supreme One of Madara turned her head and glanced at him. He found that the cold eyes of the other party were shining with fanaticism. Your Majesty? Do you know how the Dark Prophecy described this scene? The queen smiled coldly. When Duke Balakarivo sent you here, did he tell you that you can never go back? Your Majesty, no. Isaac's eyes widened. He saw the queen put her hand on his chest and gently pushed him back. His body became light, and the scene in front of him quickly receded. The master of undead alchemy let out a scream and fell from the high platform. With a light crack, countless spears pierced through his body. Isaac jerked up like a dying fish. He opened his mouth and black blood spurted out. Sophie looked coldly in this direction and turned around. No one on the battlefield noticed this scene. All the undead lords stared motionlessly at the holy sword destruction that rose slowly in the air. Although many of them had never heard of this holy sword, it was a natural feeling as if they were facing their natural enemy. Fear poured out from the depths of their hearts. The strong-willed liches were fine, but most of the undead lords who used to be warriors even collapsed to the ground. Then the Dark Knight began to retreat. The skeletal war horses they were sitting on knelt on the ground one by one, throwing them out of the saddle. A few unlucky ones even broke their necks. Although it was not a big deal for the undead, it was enough to make the scene chaotic. The Lord of Darkness had descended. It would dominate everything. A circle of black ripples spread out from the holy sword destruction in all directions. The undead on the battlefield suddenly fell to the ground. Their bodies did not suffer any damage, but the soul fire in their eye sockets had long been extinguished. Tens of millions of soul fires floated up from the battlefield and flew towards the pitch-black holy sword in the air. The Pale poem described it like this. The beginning, a world born from thoughts, the beginning of everything, the world was in chaos, water and wind, fire and lightning surrounded everything. Then creatures were born from the water, multiplied on the earth, blessed by the wind, endowed with wisdom by fire. Martha said a name, Nanainta. Light, darkness, wind, water, fire, earth, the 6 elements surrounded this world. The original laws of nature formed another 14,000 gods. Grasping all of this, it was done. Pale poem, the Book of Beginnings. One of the gods was in charge of the kingdom of the dead at the end of all life. It was Hela, the god of the underworld. Legend had it that when Hela fell, the authority of the underworld was lost to the world. It was divided into 3 parts. The most important part, the Mercury staff, was lost on the earth and established an eternal kingdom. But in the legend passed down from generation to generation in Madara, Hela would eventually return and take back the authority of the underworld. When that day came, it would be the Sabbath of the undead's eternal rest. Now, the Lord of the Kingdom of the Dead had returned to the world. Almost all the undead felt the resurrection of the underworld dragon Hela at this moment. It was in the sky, and the 17 stars that made up it were shining brightly. Long before the year of the Lord, Chaos 327, this constellation had already collapsed in the void. And at this moment, in the dark purple sky of Fenhodos, it was side by side with the war dragon. In the sky 35 degrees north of Alphonse, the god of fury, it formed the shape of a black rose. The light of the 17 stars fell on Brando's body. 17 satellites. Hala is only a god with secondary authority. Why does it have its authority? Fuchsia looked up and muttered to herself. In the void outside the elemental boundary, 2 people and a wolf reached a final agreement. Hala is the daughter of Loki and Anboda. Her existence that day was part of the plan to tell the dead. The first generation of arbitrators planned these 17 satellites and designated its secondary authority because rebooting the world was never the first choice of the ancestors. Martha wants us to remember that it is always the last and most helpless way. Sophie looked at the fluorescent atmosphere and said quietly, "Now the authority of the Ring of Nibelungen walks on the earth. He is the last king of this era, and you and he will be the 2 existences with the highest authority in this era, just like the first generation of ancestors and Martha. And now, you must decide the fate of this world together." Of course I understand. As if something had happened before, Ekis looked a little weak. His huge body became illusory and translucent like Haku's previous state. You will also understand this. The era of mortals can't be established in one era. At least we have learned enough lessons and experience this time. One day maybe it will really succeed. She shook her head. Although I don't think so. You have to be firm in your beliefs, Ekis, Haku replied with a frown. It's Lady Martha, Sophie said quietly. I don't need you to tell me that. The moment I assimilated with it, I became one with the order of this world, Ekis replied proudly. This assimilation itself wasn't her replacing me, nor was it me replacing her. I know she left some tricks behind, but I won't bother about it. But you, little elf, what did you leave behind in Nucleus 14? Why can't I enter? Nucleus 14 is Helene's domain. It is the most mysterious domain in this world. Even Martha is not the ruler of all things. You are the one who created them, but you are not a dictator. Haku replied flatly. Sophie turned around and looked at her. I won't bother with you. At least you keep your word. I didn't expect you to admit it. Well, since we have reached an agreement, it's your turn to fulfill your promise. Haku said. Ekis narrowed her eyes and looked at the faintly glowing continent of Wond. You still won't give up? What does this have to do with you? Is this how you treat the mother of all things, little elf? I will only admit it when you fulfill your promise. Ekis chuckled. She suddenly stood up, and her enormous body slowly stretched out in the void. She turned her head and silently glanced behind the realm crystal wall. Then she raised her head. Chapter 13:12. At that moment, the giant wolf's silver fur fluttered without any wind. Woo woo, woo woo woo, she closed her throat and let out a distant howl. At that moment, it echoed in the sky of Wond. On the battlefield of Erwin, both sides of Winomar stopped at the same time. The undead raised their heads and looked at the sunset sky. The necromancers ran to the center from all directions of the battlefield. The Red Knight Ladios looked at his army wizard in confusion. The lich from the south of the Sea of the Dead Moon who was in a daze. It's coming, what's coming? That legend? I don't understand, your excellency. Look, Hela's 17 stars. It's back, they're all back. Ladios frowned and raised his head. The battlefield was already in chaos. The wizards screamed and ran aimlessly to the communication crystal in the center of the battlefield. Their hysterical voices echoed throughout the battlefield. On the other side of the battlefield, Freya raised her head and asked her guards in shock, Is that a wolf's cry? It seems so, madam. Maybe it's the wolves in the direction of the Pine Mountains. Don't worry about them. What's wrong with the undead? Maybe this is our chance. Where's Lady Brunhilde? Is she here? I need the Valkyries to organize and launch an attack. Madam, just now, Lady Brunhilde and the others have left the battlefield. How? Why, did someone give them orders? I don't know, madam. They went east. East, isn't that where the army of the Queen of Banshees is? Freya's face showed an expression of disbelief. Crack. Sugar Jar looked at the broken honey jar on the ground in shock. Thick amber liquid seeped out from between the fragments of the jar. The bright liquid seemed to reflect the full moon. She raised her head and looked at the dark pine ceiling above her. Babasha trembled as she looked at this scene and muttered to herself behind her, Don't worry. It's coming, it's coming. Do you hear that, my master? If it was any other day, Sugar Pot might have reprimanded her servant, but at this moment, this little girl's face revealed a rare look of anxiety. The omen of calamity. Her heart began to beat violently. She suddenly turned around and rushed out of the house. Outside the room, the twin witches beside the Witch Queen were just about to push open the door when the three of them collided with each other. Ouch! The two little Lolas immediately cried out in pain. Ever since they left Rushta, they had always been at odds with Brando's witches. If it was in the past, they would have already fought with each other. But now they didn't have time to express their dissatisfaction. One of the little Lolas got up and shouted at the sugar jar. "Do you have the man-devouring demonic book? Hurry up and take it out." Page 650. Another Loli added. Sugar Pot had already crawled up and quickly took down a dusty black book from the bookshelf. She swept the black cover with her hand, sweeping off a thick layer of dust. Then she opened the book, and the rows of sharp teeth on the title page immediately retracted. The room was quiet, and only the sound of pages flipping could be heard. For a moment, dust flew everywhere, causing everyone to cough. But all of a sudden the sugar jar stopped. Between the pages of the thick book in her hand, the words written on it were emitting a bright golden light. It was just a few short sentences. Above the Fenhodo Strait, a deep purple color was swallowing the last touch of golden red in the sky. The stars were like sand at the bottom of the sea, shining dazzlingly. The howling of wolves resounded through the sky. It seemed to come from all directions and lingered in everyone's heart for a long time. In the legends of the 10 cities, the wolves were the omen before the end of the world. They would always sweep across the land before the first snowstorm, tearing apart all the hope before the harsh winter. The howling of wolves was like a nightmare in the north wind. It was stationed in the depths of every veteran hunter's heart, making them tremble in the nightmare. But this time they intimidated the undead of Madara. 11 girls appeared on the battlefield. No one even saw where they came from. Their long silver hair fluttered in the wind. They stretched their necks and howled on the rocks, responding to the call of their mothers. The wolves seemed to appear from the fog in all directions. They moved forward around the battlefield like waves. Then it was the endless calamity of wolves. The dark nobles of Madara watched this scene without moving. The sea of undead that they were proud of. The army of the crystal cluster that they once regarded as a great enemy. But in front of this black tide they were not worth mentioning. Those giant black wolves that were the size of hills slammed their claws on the ground. They retracted their claws and crossed with each other again. As they ran, they made thunderous sounds that fell on everyone's heart like raindrops. Even if their hearts had stopped beating, they could still feel the deep fear at this moment. A few years ago, they had destroyed this world several times. The records of the calamity of wolves were recorded in the thick ancient books of Wone that were sealed under the dust of history. Between the lines, they were full of the aura of destruction and despair. And today, they came again. But this time, it was not the declaration of the end of the world. Dim Corfa stood on top of a high mound, her hands clenched tightly into fists. The beautiful white wolf beside her said softly, "Don't worry, I'm sorry. Sister, this is what Lord Milos told us, fate. But I hate all of this. I hate this world. I hate that man. Where's Mother?" The black wolves like a tide surged past the high mound. They surrounded Brando as if they were guarding a high and mighty king. Their howls rose and fell one after another as they pounced in the direction of the undead. The dark monarch herds the wolves. Before the end of the world, disaster follows. In his eyes, there are no secrets in the world. Delphian read these words in a daze. The ancient words seemed to come true at this moment. Insursta looked at this scene in disbelief. "No." He suddenly turned his head and said loudly to his colleagues in the language of the Nine Phoenix, "Tarkus, what are you hesitating for? The future that His Majesty promised us, has it come true?" "No, it hasn't. Tarkus, we must stop him. Madara must not fail." After that, he drew his sword and rushed toward Brando. His actions were so sudden that Medisa and Hipamela couldn't react in time. Although Phoenix Wa understood the undead knight's words, she was standing too far away and couldn't make it in time. Insursta rushed to Brando's side in a stride. He raised his sword and stabbed at the latter. But Brando's mind was tied to the 5 rising holy swords at this moment. He did not completely lose consciousness. He only stretched out a finger and blocked Insursta's sword. A look of despair appeared on the latter's face. Brando looked down at him. "You have broken your promise and blasphemed the glory of the Dark Nobles." "I don't care, Count. Kill me. For Madara, I will die without regrets." Insursta's face showed a determined look and said loudly. At this time, Medisa's spear arrived, and the tip of the spear was pointed at Insursta's back. Tarkus wanted to stop her, but was stopped in place by Hippamela's spell. "Don't, Insursta." Tarkus's face showed anxiety for the first time. "My lord, don't kill him." The silver elf princess's spear stopped at Insursta's back, because she saw Brando shaking his head at him. Insursta's face was pale. Of course, he knew that he had just walked around the door of death. The undead were not afraid of eternal death, but in the face of destruction, the first reaction of any intelligent being was instinctive resistance. Unless it was crazy. But Insursta was obviously not crazy. "Why don't you kill me?" he said in a hoarse voice. "Count, let me be buried with the Black Rose of Roman Tua. You have a lot of talents under you. You don't need me. If I don't kill you, Madara will not be destroyed. You can still be loyal to your queen. Don't you see?" Brando turned to Tarkus and said, "Tarkus, take your friend down. He is a little irrational." Tarkus shook his head and bowed to thank Brando. He sighed and went forward to pull his colleague. "Tarkus, why have you also betrayed the Empire? My friend, don't you understand? This is the will of Her Majesty." "What?" Brando shook his head. The Black Lord could be said to be the #1 genius of Madara in the future. His talent in battlefield command was unparalleled. He may be a little immature now, but in the future he may surpass Medisha. He was not comparable to people like Erwin and the three heroes. But after all, no one was perfect. This somewhat unruly Madara general lacked a keen political sense and vision. Except for Tarkus, his relationship with almost everyone in Madara was not so harmonious. Perhaps it was because of this that the Supreme of Madara let him partner with Tarkus. As it turned out, these two were also the most perfect partners. And thinking of the Queen of Madara, Brando couldn't help but raise his head and look in that direction. In the center of the retreating undead army on the battlefield, Her Majesty and her guards still insisted on not retreating. Her guards were like reefs standing in the middle of the battlefield. Thousands of meters away, Brando seemed to be able to see the dark eyes of the other party, silently looking in this direction. So what was the other party thinking? Her Majesty the Queen of Madara. He looked back. Bai's figure had long disappeared. Chapter 13:13. What is this place? The flames crackled as sparks danced in the air. The distorted heat wave blurred the scene in front of them. It was like a street. The street was not spacious, but it was paved with stone slabs. There were 2 trenches for carriages. On both sides of the street were 2 or 3-story tall brick buildings, but most of them were only left with their frames. From time to time, the sound of buildings collapsing could be heard. There were also sounds of fighting, screams of despair, begging and cursing. The flames that reached the sky reflected a fiery red color on the horizon. Smoke and dust rose into the sky, forming thick black clouds. Is this Westminster? Braggs? Why is this happening? His mind was muddled as if there were countless voices lingering in his head. They seemed to be talking loudly, arguing with each other, whispering and chattering. Sometimes it was a man, sometimes it was a woman, sometimes it was an old man, sometimes it was a child. Shut up. Shut up. Tersh shook his head and shouted loudly. Sure enough, all the sounds stopped. He saw another scene. It was a dark and empty world, and there seemed to be solid ground beneath his feet. A group of people wearing white robes and emitting fluorescent light were walking forward. Those people had no faces or hair, and he seemed to be involuntarily following them. Turst, Turst. A ghostly voice called his name through the void of space. The voice reminded him of his own childhood in the countryside of Wainomar, when he had hidden in the stables, separated by a thin wooden wall, and the wet nurse had called his name. Then the door was violently flung open, and he saw the face that haunted his dreams, and that he least wished to recall, his nominal father, the Duke of Grenoires, who glared at him as coldly and angrily as he remembered it. That face quickly changed into his elder brother's look of contempt. I will kill you, Turst. No. Turst screamed in horror, but the voice quickly changed in his mind. It was the voice of his first woman, his maid. That poor woman had died in an epidemic, and he didn't have much memory of it. Turst, Turst. No, shut up, you damned ghost, stay away from me. He moaned with a pale face. He retreated, and the scene in front of him blurred. The pale figures disappeared, and he saw a boundless plain. The ground was black, the sky was blood red, and the sound of killing filled his mind like a tide. Tersh screamed as he covered his ears. His eyes were wide open in agony as he stared at the scene in front of him. It was a tragic battle. Countless creatures and monsters that he couldn't name were fighting each other on the battlefield. The side of the battle seemed to be humans, but he had never seen such powerful humans. They could summon all kinds of weapons, and in an instant they poured out doomsday-like power on the battlefield. They rained fire on the battlefield, and the monsters died in their hands. They then created a few bright suns between heaven and earth. The suns seemed to absorb all the light around them, turning the world into darkness. When they were born, all the monsters around them vaporized in an instant, turning into smoke and dust. They also dropped meteorites from above the clouds. The meteorites passed through the thick black clouds, leaving behind a few golden red lines that were perpendicular to the ground. Then they caused a series of explosions and roars on the battlefield. But there were still too many monsters. As if there was no end to them. Burning crystal shards pierced through the sky and fell into the human camp, creating huge craters. Then giant crystal monsters crawled out of the craters, easily killing the powerful humans. Then came the insects. Insects that blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Countless insects died before they could even get close to the humans, turning into dust. But they were also pervasive. More and more insects landed on the human camp, and the powerful humans began to retreat after a short period of resistance. Terse saw a giant wolf as large as a hill slaughtering its way into the human camp. The humans' retreat quickly turned into collapse. A sense of despair enveloped his soul. It was as if he had some sort of blood connection with these powerful humans. When he saw them fall, he suddenly understood that this was the final battle of this world. They had lost. No. Terse muttered as he knelt on the ground, covering his face with his hands. He saw a group of silver-white monsters appearing on the horizon. There weren't many of them, but the humans couldn't do anything to them. They were like silver lines that pierced through the battlefield, causing the humans to fall one by one. A silver-white monster landed not far from him, then turned around and looked at him. Terse's eyes widened, his entire body trembling as he trembled. Don't kill me. A bright and snow-white blade was reflected in his eyes, plunging straight into his throat. No. Terse screamed in despair as he felt his throat turn cold. Everything in front of him quickly distorted and melted into the darkness. Plop, plop. The sound of snow being squeezed together could be heard. A pair of moccasins that were tightly tied with leather ropes was trudging through the snow near Xena Forest. The owner of the boots suddenly stopped. The owner of the boots was dressed in a hunter's attire commonly seen in the Eagle Castle area. He had a thick jacket, tight leather pants, and deerskin gloves missing 2 fingers. He carried a bow and a quiver of arrows on his back and a bunch of other things on his belt. There were even 2 animal traps hanging from his belt. He was about 67 years old, in the prime of his life at one's age. His skin was dark, and it was obvious that he was an experienced hunter who had spent a lot of time in the wilderness. The man had 2 hunting dogs on his leash. The dogs were sniffing around the ground, but the first snow of late autumn in the north interfered with their judgment, causing them to hesitate. After a while, one of the dogs raised its head and barked towards a direction in the forest. A lot of snowflakes fell from the trees. A group of riders came out from the forest behind the hunters. The leader of the group, an elderly knight, pulled on the reins and asked, "Did you find anything, Pierce?" "There's something in the forest, my lord." "Could it be a herd of deer?" "No, my lord, there's no trace of a herd of deer nearby." "Maybe it's a rabbit or some other small animal," a young knight said. "No, the dogs are very uneasy. Only bears in the forest can make them so uneasy." "But the bears are hibernating now, so you can't see them," Pierce said with certainty. "Maybe there's 1 or 2 that aren't so afraid of the cold. The snow isn't thick yet, so they have to hurry out and store food." Duke Hoffman waved his hand. "Believe in Pierce. He's the best hunter around here. Draw your swords. Boys, let's go in and take a look." "No, my lord, let me go in and take a look. I'm familiar with the forest. If there's anything strange, I can at least send a message," Pierce replied in a deep voice. Duke Hoffman looked at the old hunter and nodded. The forest quickly became quiet. The young knight seemed a little nervous. There were many ancient legends about the forest. There was a forest with many old human faces carved in it. It was said that the person who carved them was once the owner of the forest. But these people had long been lost in the depths of the forest, leaving behind all kinds of mysterious sayings. Not only the humans but the horses also seemed a little uneasy. The war horses of the 10 cities area all came from Ice Bay, which was further north. They were cold-resistant, tall, and covered with hair. Wild horses fought with wolves all year round, so they were fierce, brave, and wild. But these Ice Bay horses were now snorting, and white mist with warmth came out of their nostrils, condensing around the cage. They used their hooves to scratch the ground as if something in the forest made them very nervous. The knight comforted their companions, but Duke Hoffman's face was full of seriousness. According to the tradition of the Eagle Castle, the forest would be frozen after winter. It was said that the ancient spirits would appear in the depths of the forest to patrol and hunt. So no matter if it was farmers or hunters, they would not enter Xena Forest in winter, because it would offend the ancient spirits and bring about a curse. If not for the fact that he had no other choice as the owner of this land, he would also not be willing to enter the forest in this season. He had been in charge of the Eagle Castle for 63 years. Including his long youth, he had lived here for almost a century. As an old man, he was very clear that these traditions and taboos could not be violated. But there was a reason for this. 2 days ago, a strange thing had happened in the forest, so he had no choice but to come here and investigate everything clearly. Speaking of which, this matter had to be told before the short summer in the 10 cities area ended. That was something that happened 3 months ago. The wild elves came across the sea, disembarked in the 10 cities area, and then went east, passing through more than half of the northern territory. One of them just happened to arrive at the Eagle Castle. Duke Hoffman had already received an order from the Holy Church, and understood that these elves would not stay in his territory for too long. As such, he allowed them to stay outside the far Eagle Castle for a while. As expected, around a week later the elves left towards the east. After entering Xena Forest, they disappeared without a trace. East of Xena Forest, after passing through the Heather Hills, the only place to go was the endless Great Glacier. Before the year of the return of light, the Pioneer Knight from Fanzan expanded east along this road, and there they bumped into the border of the World of Order. Chapter 13-14. However, with the end of the pioneering era, fewer and fewer people crossed Xena Forest to head to the Great Glacier. In the first 2 centuries of the First Era, there were still a few adventurers who would try their luck there, but as more and more people went missing, the Great Glacier and the Heather Hills gradually became synonymous with death. In Duke Hoffman's memory, the last time an adventurer appeared in the Eagle Castle was around the year of the croaking of frogs. After that, no one came here again, and the Eagle Castle gradually became a desolate border area that no one patronized. Thus, he couldn't help but be curious about what the elves were doing in the east. Was it related to the legendary treasure buried in the Great Glacier? With such curiosity, he ordered people to keep watch at the entrance of the forest day and night, wanting to see when the elves would return. But no one would have thought that the elves would be gone for 3 months. After that, there was no news of them at all. After a short summer, the 10 cities region entered the bleak autumn season. Before the snowfall, both beasts and humans had to stock up on food. The residents of the far Eagle Castle also had to prepare for the annual festival. All kinds of mundane affairs began to become busy. Naturally, he had forgotten about this matter. After all, regardless of whether the elves were completely annihilated in the Great Glacier or whether they brought back any treasures, it had nothing to do with the residents of Eagle Castle. Although Duke Hoffman was the owner of this place, there was nothing he could do about the wild elves, especially when the Templar Church did not show any obvious attitude. Just like that, on the night before the winter ritual, the hunter he sent to Xena Forest suddenly appeared outside the gates of Eagle Fortress as though he had gone mad and declared loudly, "That's right, the hunter who I sent to Xena Forest. He saw an army of spirits." Naturally, no one believed this nonsense at first, but the hunter was determined not to take a step closer to the forest. He swore solemnly and looked like he was on the verge of a mental breakdown. He shouted at everyone saying something about ghosts, pale armies and the like. Eagle Castle wasn't big and there weren't many residents. Naturally, such an incident quickly spread to the Duke's ears. His attitude was different from normal people. When he heard about this unlucky young man's encounter, he immediately thought of the ancient legend of his family, the ancestral spirits in the forest. According to the legend, the ancestors of Eagle Castle had received a gift from the ancestral spirits in the forest. That was how they were able to establish a foothold on this land and establish this territory. From then on, they became nobles of the 10 cities. However, there weren't many written records of that legend in the family. He had only heard his grandfather talk about it once, and only then did he know that there was such a thing. Although the legend sounded like a fairy tale, it was said that the ancestor who built the far Eagle Castle had once lost his way in the forest. In the midst of hunger and cold, he had hallucinations and saw the ancestor spirits in the forest. The ancestor spirits led him to a forest full of carvings. There, they entertained him and gave him a fire seed and a piece of stone. Later, the ancestral spirits of Eagle Castle, Eagle, of Eagle, Eagle Castle, Eagle, Eagle and Eagle Castle, Eagle Castle. That fire seed was still preserved within the far Eagle Castle's sacred hall, illuminating this desolate land for thousands of years. As for that piece of stone, it was said that during a winter hunt, due to the accidental death of the far Eagle Castle's patriarch, it was forever left in the depths of the forest. It was also from that era that the Xena forest in winter became a forbidden area for Eagle Castle. The descendants of Eagle Castle had always believed that the piece of stone was their lucky charm, because ever since the piece of stone was lost, the family began to decline. Night explorers and adventurers no longer appeared on this land, and the once prosperous Eagle Castle fell into a difficult situation. Duke Schaffman was a devout believer of the Holy Church, and he had always maintained a respectful attitude towards the ancestral spirits in the forest and these mysterious legends. However, in his heart he also believed that the missing piece of stone had a special connection with the rise and fall of Eagle Castle. However, he had a different opinion from his grandfather and parents. He believed that the piece of stone was a sacred item bestowed to the family by Sage Fanzin, and that the family had suffered such a punishment because they had carelessly lost it. Just like the ancestors of the family, he had always wanted to find the piece of stone. And the scene that the young hunter had described that night was no doubt an opportunity, igniting the old duke's long-cherished wish. In the young hunter's description, the army he saw advancing in the fog was very similar to the legend that had been passed down in the family for generations. The ancestral spirits in the forest had appeared once again. In that case, was that stone fragment going to return to the far Eagle Castle again? Duke Schaffman couldn't help but have such thoughts. Although almost everyone advised against entering Xena Forest in winter, he definitely couldn't wait until spring when the ice and snow melted. He thought that perhaps this was a test given to him by Sage Fanzin. If he didn't have the courage to accept this test, then the Eagle Castle would forever miss the opportunity to obtain the piece of stone. With such a firm thought, he led the knight and a few experienced hunters into the forest. However, after entering this mysterious forest, Duke Schaffman couldn't help but feel uneasy. After all, there were just too many legends about it. Even the Xena forest didn't only have good legends about it. Many people had gone missing in the forest in search of it, never to return. People often said that those people were sealed in the Xena tree, becoming a human face on it. Although Duke Schaffman had always been dismissive of the rumors of these rural farmers, when he truly entered this eerily quiet forest, those strange legends couldn't help but appear in everyone's hearts. After Pierce entered the forest, not a single sound came from the forest for a long time. The sounds of the two hunting dogs were also swallowed up by the sea of trees. The silence made everyone's hair stand on end, as if something was constantly watching them from behind. Duke Schaffman took off his mink gloves. He couldn't stand the silence and was about to order the knight to do something, but it was at this time that he suddenly heard a whistle. This sudden sound scared him so much that he almost fell off his horse, but it was at this time that he heard his knight let out a cheer. He quickly raised his head and saw Pierce walking out of the forest. "What took you so long?" Duke Schaffman asked in dissatisfaction. "I ran into some trouble," Pierce replied. "There was a person in the forest. His condition wasn't very good, so I spent some time to help him. Otherwise, I don't know if he would have survived." "A person?" "Yes, he doesn't seem to be a local. Before he fainted, he kept saying that he wanted to see you, my lord." "You wanted to see me? Does he know me?" Duke Schaffman was slightly surprised. "No, he said that he wanted to see the highest officer here, but we don't have any officers here." "I think he was talking about you," Pierce replied. As he spoke, he took out something from his pocket. "He also gave me this. I don't know what it is." Duke Schaffman's eyes narrowed slightly. He saw that the old hunter was holding a piece of brown stone in his hand. The smoke over the Finhodo Strait finally dissipated after the last ray of sunlight disappeared into the horizon. Enveloped by the will of the Holy Sword of Annihilation, the undead who had lost their will to fight did not resist for too long. The low-level undead were the first to betray the will of the Roman Black Rose and abandon their original master. When the Black Knight, who resisted the most, was completely devoured by the wolves, there was no longer any suspense on the battlefield. About half an hour later, Brando once again met the Supreme of Madara. She was obviously not in a good situation. When he passed through the wolves, he saw that Her Majesty was surrounded in the middle of the wolves with a few famous undead lords in history. Among these undead lords were the famous Lord of the Black Plague, Fazit, and the Pale King Gao Duo. Both of them had fought against the Erewhon in history. Brando had even fought Fazit head-on, and Gao Duo, the Pale King, was still active on the battlefield until the Second Age. During the Battle of Algash, he was directly opposite the Allied army. Brando knew that both of them were loyal followers of the Mercury Staff. One of them was transformed from a high-grade lich, and the other was wrapped in black armor. They seemed to be of the same race as Cabius. At this moment they were standing on the left and right of Her Majesty, each holding a weapon. Obviously they did not intend to give up on resisting. Between the two, the Black Plague had once caused a tragic massacre in Winomar. It and its underlings had directly turned all the Erewhon people in Winomar into undead. Brando had personally experienced that massacre, and naturally did not intend to let this guy go. However, at this moment he did not even look at the repulsive guy. Instead, his gaze fell on Her Majesty. The woman still maintained her cold and arrogant expression. She also looked at him coldly, as if she did not have the slightest self-consciousness of a loser. Her eyes were proud and firm. Brando was silent for a while before he spoke. "Your Majesty, I think we should talk." "What do you want to talk about, human?" "It's about the Erewhon and Madara." A light flashed in the woman's black eyes. "The Holy Sword judgment is in your hands. How do you plan to treat Madara? P.S. Continue to ask for votes." Chapter 13-15. What would happen to the Black Rose of Roman Tuaw in the future? This question stumped Brando, and the first thought that came to his mind was, kill this woman and get rid of all future troubles. From now on, Madara will no longer have the Mercury Staff, and it will not appear again for at least 1,000 years. The undead will once again become scattered sand, and finally be dismembered and disappear from this world. As an Erewhon citizen, a player of Erewhon in his previous life, and even if he was just a living creature, it was not strange for him to have such thoughts. No one liked the undead, and the Druids thought that they were monsters that twisted nature and should not exist in this world. Fanzin's holy church publicly declared that they were enemies of the undead, and categorized them as cultists. Although the Wind Elves and Cruz people of Saint Tassol were milder, they had been fighting with Madara for years on the border. For most of the lower-class citizens of the country who had to deal with the undead were enemies or even enemies. In the years of war, there was an irreconcilable hatred between both sides. Just like Brando and Freya, the blood and fire of Butchie's escape, for those who had experienced it, how could they forget it? That was the road paved with the blood of their loved ones. The heart-wrenching cries of Butchie and Fortress Reeden, the separation of life and death, how could they forget it so easily? But Brando knew that he could not do it. Madara was a huge country, and although Insursta called it an empire, in reality, at least in this era, it could not be considered a true centralized empire. It had a supreme ruler, and in the past 10 years of hard work, this supreme ruler with the Mercury Staff had indeed made most of the nobles in the country submit to him, and the will of the emperor could already cover the core area of the empire. However, an outdated system could not be completely changed in a short 10 years. Madara's political, economic, and power structure had not walked out of the shadows of the past. His Majesty had only completed the forced unification of the military, and used benefits to make the Dark Lords reach an agreement with him. This kind of power was born from the Mercury Staff, but it could also be destroyed by the Mercury Staff. The rise and fall of the entire empire was in the hands of a single person, and not a complete system that could be passed down from generation to generation. This was the biggest difference between it and the Dead Moon Empire in the next few decades or even a century. If he destroyed this huge undead army here, took the Mercury Staff and killed all the undead lords here, then what would the result be? The undead empire's strength, and Madara would be without a leader? The Kingdom of Darkness would fall into internal strife, and the undead would completely collapse and disappear from this world? It was not impossible. However, it was more likely that the undead who had lost control would be forced by the attacks of the Crystal Cluster, and rush into Erewhon, Antiburo, Saint Tassol, and Cruz. After losing a unified command, the undead would not be able to organize such a force to resist the Crystal Cluster. In the face of a choice between life and death, would the selfish and greedy undead lords stay and fight bravely, or would they migrate east to invade the human territory? Brando could think of the right answer even if he used his knees to think. The bigger problem was that when the undead lords fought their own battles, the Cruz people and the Wind Elves of Saint Tassol had become as hard as the Crystal Cluster to them. Then the best choice for the undead to migrate east would be the small countries like Erewhon and Antiburo. In this way the disaster of Erewhon would not be reduced but become worse. Would the Cruz people and the Wind Elves lend a helping hand? Perhaps, but they would only use Erewhon as a buffer zone between them and Madara. They would not sincerely help Erewhon to defeat the undead. In history they had made such a choice. Not to mention that behind the undead, there were thousands of Crystal Cluster troops. Brando did not want Erewhon to become the shield of a large country, nor did he want the people of Erewhon to be sacrificed meaninglessly. If he did not want to see the tragedy of Butchie repeated, he had to carefully consider how to deal with the captives at present. In his original plan, he hoped to show the power he had in his hands in front of Her Majesty, and the determination of the people of Erewhon to resist. He did not need to be too strong. He only needed to let the undead of Madara know that invading Erewhon was not worth the effort. After all, Erewhon was only a small country. It may be a little special, and its geographical location was very important. But if the undead had to suffer losses equivalent to when they invaded Cruz or even Saint Tossel to conquer Ampere Seal, then he believed that the wise Her Majesty would definitely reconsider her decision. As long as Her Majesty could give up on invading Erewhon in the Second War of the Black Rose, and fight for 2 to 30 years of development for Tonajol, the time between the Second War of the Black Rose and the War of Cipher, then when the undead expanded for the second time, Erewhon would have enough strategic depth and military strength to fight Madara. At least it would not be difficult to resist Madara's army. Although the Master of the Mercury Staff had been known for his insight in history, Brando believed that with the advantage of the lack of information he had, the chances of successfully persuading Her Majesty were quite high. After all, no one would have thought that a small country like Erewhon would have such terrifying potential. It was too small, to the point that even if everyone in the kingdom was united as one, it was meaningless in front of a giant like Madara. After that, as long as he still existed, Brando believed that Erewhon's development with the support of the Black Forest would be faster and faster. When the next generation of fire was born, Brando still did not know that it had already been born in his territory. The Black Forest would be a smooth road for Erewhon. As long as they had that fertile land, the strength and population of the kingdom would expand along with the expansion of the territory. Before it stagnated, there was almost no limit. And in his lifetime, the kingdom and the huge undead Moon Empire would be able to attack and defend each other. As long as he had enough power, Brando had plenty of ways to dismember and divide Madara. Although the Roman Black Rose's territory was vast, it was not without weaknesses. As an old rival of the Roman Black Rose for decades, he knew very well what kind of dirty tricks it had. It was just that these weaknesses were still out of reach for the weak Erewhon. In the next half a century, there would be the confrontation between the Slate War and the Dusk. At that time, the order of the world would be completely changed, and if Erewhon could seize this opportunity, he could definitely become a real powerhouse. At that time, he would also have the confidence to lead the final war against the Dusk with his experience of fighting against the Dusk tribe in his previous life. Brando had a clear desire in his heart, as if this was the goal he had to achieve in this world in this life. Perhaps this was the promise that Lady Martha had given him. But he never thought that although he did show such strength, it seemed to be a little too much. With the help of Ekis' daughters who appeared out of nowhere at the end, he actually defeated the undead army head-on. Now, things had gotten a little out of hand. At present, he had the Supreme of Madara in his hands, and even the Mercury Staff in his hands. In addition, he had nearly 1/3 of Madara's military power. But he was somewhat stunned to find that his situation had become worse. What could he do? Completely destroying this undead army seemed to be somewhat impossible, unless he was willing to push Erewhon into the fire pit. Then should he just let these undead go? Not to mention whether Brando was willing to do so, he knew that it was meaningless. He had played too big this time. He had captured Her Majesty the Queen of Madara, and also defeated the undead's Black Knight Legion. He had killed countless dark nobles, and the undead had suffered heavy losses. Although it was the other side who made the first move, in any case, there was already an irreconcilable enmity between the two sides. If he let these undead go, they would not thank him in the slightest. After all, they were not human nobles. The key was that they had to maintain the dignity and supreme position of the Mercury Staff, so it was impossible for them to admit defeat, unless he killed them. This way he would fall into an endless cycle. So when Her Majesty the Queen coldly threw out this question, Brando suddenly fell silent. He had never been a quick-witted person, nor did he have any outstanding political talent. The original crappy plan was in fact the result of him thinking for a long time, and it was a little funny because the plan was originally based on a fantasy. After the fall of the Kingdom of Erewhon, some players often wondered on the forums how they could save Erewhon out of depression. Although Brando looked down on these people who said that they were invincible, he remembered their discussions in his heart. After all, it was also his biggest regret in his heart. Of course, he had never been a blindly optimistic person. It was not that Brando did not think about what would happen if the plan failed. He had discussed this topic with Amandina, Her Majesty the Princess, and even Allium Japonicum several times. Amandina and the others had also helped him to perfect this plan more than once. This plan, from the beginning, was a vague idea in his heart. It gradually became a detailed plan with dozens of records and countless people in Valhalla preparing and working hard for it. Naturally, it could not be done by him alone. In fact, Brando did not have the ability to do so. Chapter 13-16. But among these countless records, none of them mentioned what he should do after he accidentally defeated Madara by himself. Everyone, including Amandina and the princess, approved of his idea and thought that it was very feasible, especially after they saw Valhalla's potential. But even the boldest and most radical people, even Allium Japonicum and Maynard, who had a clear vision of the future, had never considered such a problem. And now this problem was clearly placed in front of Brando. Brando looked at the dark eyes of the Queen of Madara and knew that she must have expected this. From the moment she handed him the Mercury staff, she must have calculated this situation. And he also knew that she must have a solution. But he didn't want to ask about it, because Brando knew very well that there must be a trap. This supreme person who held the Mercury staff in history had set this trap from the beginning, and even used herself as bait. How could this trap be so simple? But what made him distressed was that he quickly realized the difference in intelligence between him and the other party, because even if he racked his brains, he still couldn't figure out what the other party's purpose was. This was a little too sad. He subconsciously turned his head and looked at Medisha, who was not far away. When Amandina and her Royal Highness were not by his side, this silver elf princess might be the only think tank he could rely on. Unfortunately, Medisha was not omnipotent. She had even less information than Brando. Facing Brando's questioning gaze, she only gently shook her head, indicating that he should not act rashly. But the problem was that Brando didn't dare to act rashly at the moment. He turned his head again and looked at the queen, who was surrounded by the undead. The latter's face was expressionless, but Brando felt that this woman was extremely detestable. And the other person who made him feel extremely detestable was the Silver Elf Princess's sister, Lady Tiamas. He believed that everything in front of him must have been planned by these two women. But this stalemate was not a solution. Brando frowned and was about to speak, but he was blocked by a figure in front of him. He looked up and was stunned to find that it was Delphian. The Prime Minister's daughter whispered, "Let me talk to her, my lord. I will give you a satisfactory result." What? Delphian turned her head, her light purple eyes reflecting his face. She didn't speak, but her eyes were full of determination and persistence. "You want me to appoint you as an envoy? My lord, this identity is not enough. I have to represent Erwin to be qualified to negotiate with her." Brando was stunned for a moment. In fact, he certainly didn't have the qualifications to appoint Delphian to represent Erwin to negotiate with Madara, but at this time he wasn't so inflexible. In fact, he was surprised that the Prime Minister's daughter was willing to stand up for him. Yes, besides Amandina, only this smart young lady could handle the situation at hand. Of course, that was if she didn't have any bad intentions. Whether he could trust this young lady or not, that was the problem. After all, she had a long history of misdeeds. Even though she was now his woman and his mage servant, compared to this woman's stubbornness, these reasons were still not enough. Brando only hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "You're giving me full authority?" When she really got a confirmation, Delphian was a little surprised. "Otherwise." The Prime Minister's daughter looked at him deeply. "I will satisfy you." She turned around and faced the Queen of Madara. She tucked the diary in her hand under her arm and tidied up her clothes, then opened her mouth to answer. "Your Majesty, my lord only has one request." The Queen looked at her, then looked at Brando. She didn't speak, only waiting for the Prime Minister's daughter to continue. Delphian paused for a moment, then said with a calm face that almost scared Brando to death, "Madara must be divided into two." Brando thought that this Prime Minister's daughter must be crazy. This Supreme of Madara had a lot of cards in her hands. How could she accept such a harsh condition? And he knew very well what kind of personality she had. With this Emperor's unyielding character, it was absolutely impossible for her to accept such a humiliation. People like her, the Silver Queen, Constance, or the Supreme of Saint Tassol, Fanzan, would absolutely never succumb to a mere threat of death. For these people, they would never do something like dividing the empire even if they died. Although the Silver Queen, Constance, took the initiative to start the civil war, her purpose was definitely not to divide the empire. It was only to eliminate internal opposition, eliminate the prestige of the Holy Cathedral, and establish a more centralized cruise. Just like the Myrna Empire before the War of the Holy Saints. Brando's face changed slightly. He almost thought that Delphian said this deliberately to anger the other party and make Erwin and Madara completely break off. But he immediately realized that Erwin and Madara were not far from completely breaking off. No matter what this Prime Minister's daughter said, it was impossible to make the situation worse. Thinking this through, he relaxed a little and refocused his attention on the negotiation. He thought that Her Majesty of Madara would be furious, or at least show a disdainful attitude. But what Brando didn't expect was that not only did the woman not show the slightest contempt or anger on her face, but there was a flash of light in her eyes. "Oh," she then asked, "what are you going to do?" "Your Majesty, Your Majesty." The undead lords around her hurriedly opened their mouths anxiously. Most of them looked at Brando and Delphian angrily. Of course, if those skulls could show such an expression on their faces. But at least the vampires had an angry look on their faces. Brando looked at these people and couldn't help but think, yes, this is a normal expression. But Her Majesty coldly reprimanded her subjects. "Shut up." The majesty of the Mercury staff seemed to be so deeply rooted in people's hearts that these undead lords actually shut their mouths one after another. Delphian spoke with assurance. Her plan was very simple. Let Madara continue to keep the core area that was now under the rule of the Mercury staff and build a new country based on it. In fact, this was the future goal of the Roman Black Rose. But in history, the Supreme One with the Mercury staff was more ambitious. She built Madara with a wider territory, including the land of eternal gloom and the core territory loyal to her. She also annexed the undead in the west and the liches of Balakarivo to build a huge unified Madara. But in fact, this process was not done overnight, because the kingdom of the dead moon had not been a whole since Loki's era. This dark exile was mainly made up of the four most important parts, except for the scattered undead territories around it. One of them was the land of eternal gloom or the land of eternal gloom. It was the territory of the vampires and the Dark Knight, and also the base of the Mercury staff. It was also the hometown of the Insursta dragon and Tarkus. Historically, the vampires and the Dark Knight nobles were among the first forces to support the rise of the Mercury staff. They also benefited the most in the process of the rise of Madara. Among the original four forces of Madara, only two survived after the formation of the Empire. One of them was the traditional noble force formed by the vampires and the Dark Knight. The other three forces, including the undead, the liches of Balakarivo, and the tens of thousands of Dark Lords in the southern territory of the Dead Moon, were completely wiped out in the process. They were either broken up and reintegrated into the new empire, or they were completely killed on the battlefield, never to be seen again. Among them, the liches of Balakarivo were the former. They were spared because they submitted in time and were finally divided by this Supreme One. Except for a part of them joining the Undead Mage Group, most of them later joined the Undead Alchemy Association, a huge organization. As for the liches of Balakarivo, they became a historical term. As their role model, the undead who resisted the Mercury staff the most resolutely among the three forces ended up the most miserable. They were almost completely erased from Madara's history. By the middle of the Second Era, including the players who entered Madara in the later stages, very few people knew anything about this historical term. As for the Dark Lords in the southern territory of the Dead Moon, they were relatively unknown. In his previous life, Brando also learned about the existence of these undead lords far beyond the borders of the Wone civilization through the existence of the mercenaries of the undead during the Second War of the Black Rose. Now that he thought about it, it might be because the latter had basically been exhausted in the war with the Crystal Cluster. The process of the integration of these four forces was a long process even for the Dark Empire. The Dark Knight and the vampires in the land of everlasting death, who were the earliest supporters of the Mercury staff, were completely wiped off the mark of the old noble forces after the Battle of the Oblique Forest. As for the undead who were the last to submit, only at the end of the First Era did the Supreme One of Madara find the opportunity to make a move on them. Chapter 13-17. However, this process took almost a century. If it weren't for the asymmetry of time in the game, Brando and the other players wouldn't have been able to witness the entire process of the Undead Empire's integration. In fact, even after the integration there were all kinds of problems. Whether it was the First or the Second Era to the Mercury staff, the ones who were truly loyal to her were the Dark Nobles in the Land of Eternity and a small number of liches in Balakarivo, as well as the forces of the Queen of Banshees. Therefore, Delphian's words weren't completely unreasonable. Brando listened to her list of these problems one by one and used it as a basis to support her argument. She proposed to divide Madara into two and rule over the land. He was surprised to find that this Prime Minister's daughter seemed to have a deep understanding of Madara. However, he knew that a few weeks ago, this Prime Minister's daughter definitely didn't know so much about this Roman Black Rose. When he was in Rushta, he talked to her about the relationship between Erwin and Madara. At that time she didn't know much about it. She only mentioned that as his advisor, she would look up more information in the future if she had the chance. He didn't expect her to really go. Brando knew that this Delphian didn't have any good intentions towards him at that time. The only reason she could do this was because she was trying too hard to play her role well. Thinking that he was targeted by such a woman and was still alive today, he really had to thank Lady Martha for her protection. However, even if Delphian had reason and evidence, Brando didn't think that the Queen of Madara would agree with her words. Indeed, the Mercury Staff didn't control too many territories outside of the Land of Eternity. However, in name, whether it was the undead or the liches in Balakarivo, they had all expressed their loyalty to her. Although he didn't know the attitude of the Dark Lords in the southern sea of the Dead Moon, they were willing to send mercenaries to fight for the Queen in the Second War of the Black Rose. Under such circumstances, anyone with a discerning eye could see that the unification of Madara was only a matter of time. As long as the Mercury Staff wasn't lost, as long as the Queen still maintained her authority, she would reach the pinnacle of power sooner or later. How could such a proud existence agree to such a proposal? Indeed, the Mercury Staff wasn't in her hands, but so what? Brando didn't dare to casually deprive the Queen of her authority. Otherwise, he would be waiting for the undead to be driven into Erewhon by the crystal cluster. What gave him a headache was that the Queen was clearly aware of this. Otherwise, she wouldn't be so fearless. However, what surprised Brando was that after hearing Delphian's words, the seemingly cold woman pondered for a moment and asked, "Why should I agree to such a proposal? Why should I agree to such a proposal? What can we gain from it?" Even though she did not directly agree, Brendel's mouth was already agape. He originally thought that the Queen would definitely sternly reject him. Based on his understanding of the other party's personality, this was the Madara's majesty that he was familiar with. However, he suddenly realized that he didn't know much about the Queen. On the other hand, the Prime Minister's daughter was very calm. She replied, "The Mercury Staff. You will return the Mercury Staff to us?" The Queen narrowed her eyes slightly. A light flashed in her dark eyes. "Little girl, Gila has already returned to this world. The Mercury Staff is now a part of her destruction. Are you sure what you are saying?" Behind her, the undead lords were also in an uproar. Those who could appear on this battlefield, apart from Dai Lin who had been killed by her scheme and Isaac who had died at the hands of her own people, were mostly her trusted aides. Just like the Insursta Dragon and Tarkus, their honor and disgrace had long been inextricably linked to the Mercury Staff. Otherwise, with the greedy and indifferent nature of the undead, they would have long abandoned Her Majesty who had lost the Mercury Staff. Why would they be here to live and die with her? After all, losing the Mercury Staff meant that this supreme being had lost his prestige and authority. He had lost the only legitimacy of Madara, and this was a fatal blow to the new empire. However, for these Black Knight and vampire nobles who had already tied themselves to the Mercury Staff's chariot, it was easy to get on, but difficult to get off. Therefore they had no choice but to persevere. It was also because of this that when the undead lords heard Delphian's words, there was inevitably a commotion. If they were originally in a desperate situation where they had no choice but to fight to the death with Brando, now there was a way out. Although the undead claimed to worship the eternal rest, in reality if they didn't have to die, they most likely wouldn't choose to do so. However, Brando felt that it was very strange. He wanted to pull Delphian back and ask her how she was going to return the Mercury Staff. After all, that thing had been completely absorbed by the Holy Sword Annihilation. Even if he was now the owner of Annihilation, it was impossible for him to split it into three and return the Mercury Staff. The only possibility he could think of was that the Prime Minister's daughter was planning to deceive the Queen. This thought immediately made him break out in cold sweat. Deceive the owner of the Mercury Staff in history, the Queen of Madara? Was this Prime Minister's daughter really not planning to sell them off? However, he knew that he couldn't take the initiative to speak now. If he didn't speak, there might still be room for negotiation. But if he spoke, it was equivalent to bursting this balloon that was getting bigger and bigger. Perhaps these undead captives would be so angry that they would die together with them on the spot. Forget it, Brando thought to himself. Anyway, the current situation couldn't be that bad. The worst-case scenario was nothing more than what he expected. He just had to prepare to go back to Erewhon and fight Madara head-on. At least Madara would have one less Mercury Staff holder, right? At least he wouldn't have to worry about Erewhon facing a unified huge empire in a few decades. Although the crystal cluster was still a problem. Thinking of this, he no longer cared about Delphian's negotiation and let the Prime Minister's daughter speak. After listening to Her Majesty's rhetorical question, Delphi glanced at the Queen and replied, "Your Majesty wants that Mercury Staff. Your Majesty knows best, don't you think?" The Prime Minister of Madara's dark eyes suddenly lit up. She looked deeply at Delphian and then suddenly said to Brando, "You have a good subordinate, but unfortunately, a bright pearl is cast before the swine. If she was by my side, I could go further than you, Count Brando. After saying that, she waved her hand. I need to think about it. Please go back, Count Brando. Brando couldn't help but look at Delphian, thinking what it meant to cast a bright pearl before the swine. If he could, he would be happy to give this lady away. Unfortunately, not to mention whether she would agree or not, the Planeswalker system wouldn't allow it. However, the Queen's reaction was far beyond his expectations. If he still couldn't see that she was interested in this proposal, then he would be a complete idiot. Fortunately, although Brando never claimed to be intelligent, at least he wasn't stupid. Delphian turned around, walked to his side, pulled on his sleeve, and motioned for him to step aside to talk. Brando also wanted to figure out what was going on with this inexplicable negotiation. In his impression, the Queen definitely didn't have such a personality. If he didn't remember wrongly, then the other party must have swapped her. But he felt that both of these were unlikely. Delphian pulled him all the way to Medicia's side. Before the Prime Minister's daughter opened her mouth, the Silver Elf Princess frowned and asked, "My lord, what did the Queen do to you?" "What do you mean, what did she do?" Brando was shocked by the Silver Elf Princess's serious face and quickly explained, "Medicia, I have nothing to do with her." "My lord." Medicia was so angry that her face turned red. Brando then reacted and hurriedly wiped the sweat on his forehead. "This? I didn't mean that. I only fought with her once in the extreme planes and nothing else." "But that doesn't make sense," Medicia replied. Her negotiation with Miss Delphian was obviously premeditated. Premeditated? Brando was puzzled. The Silver Elf Princess looked at Delphian, the Prime Minister's daughter nodded and said, "My lord, I'm sorry I didn't make it clear to you before. Can't you see that it's not us who wants to negotiate with her, it's her who wants to negotiate with us? What I said before was actually just pushing the boat along with the current." "Wait." Brando frowned and interrupted her. "I don't quite understand what you mean, Miss Delphian. You mean that Her Majesty took the initiative to divide Madara into two?" Delphian nodded silently. "Although it's a bit unbelievable in my opinion, this is the only possibility." "That's impossible." "It's possible, my lord," Delphian explained. "What is the most important thing to Madara? It's not power nor authority but the Mercury Staff. Only the Mercury Staff can unite this powerful but scattered country. Other than that, whether it's territory, population or anything else, it's meaningless to it. But now that Gila has returned and the Holy Sword Destroyer is in your hands, Her Majesty can only choose to submit, or she will lose her supreme position in Madara. And the key is that this power is not based on great power or a long history of the rules of the game. Think about it, what kind of revenge will she and the undead lords on her war chariot face?" Medicia also nodded. She seemed to have sorted out her thoughts. Her Majesty is a very clear-headed person. She has already thought of a way out. She was just waiting for us to speak. Fortunately, Delphian saw this early on. Otherwise, if we spoke rashly, she might have taken the initiative. "That's not right," Brando muttered. "What's not right?" Medicia was stunned and asked, puzzled. "Teacher, do you want to ask how we should return the Mercury Staff to Her Majesty?" At this time, Huang Hua, who was at the side, finally spoke. "That's very simple." The Prime Minister's daughter smiled. "I've already said it very clearly before. Her Majesty wants Madara's Mercury Staff. She knows this very well in her heart. As for whether the Mercury Staff is the real thing or not, is that important? Miss Delphian, this is not very good." When the people around heard this, they immediately broke out in cold sweat. That was the Mercury Staff, the supreme item of the Roman Black Rose. How could it be fake? That was originally the Emperor's new clothes. Think about it, how many people can come into contact with the Mercury Staff? Delphian was very confident. Those people are the Queen's confidants. Their honor and disgrace are closely related to Her Majesty. Will they expose this lie? Or do the undead really need a powerful scepter? What they need is just the symbolic meaning of it, Sui Xiong said. That's enough. No. Brando shook his head. There's a problem here. What problem? Brando raised his head and said word by word to Medicia and Delphian, "You're all right. But there's a problem. She was the one who gave me the Mercury Staff." What? Chapter 13-19. Although he did not know what the Queen of Madara was up to, Medicia and Delphian had no idea. Brando naturally would not torture his brain and could only put this question aside for now. Of course, he suspected that Tarkus might know something, but he did not seem to be willing to speak. Moreover, he and Insursta had already received his permission to return to the undead camp. The vampire even gracefully bid farewell to him before he left. On the other hand, the Black Lord of Madara seemed to be in low spirits, especially after knowing the content of the negotiation between the Queen and Delphian. The negotiation wasn't done in one go. At most, it was just an exchange of opinions. This agreement also involved a lot of details such as the specific range of Madara's kingdom, how to set up the buffer zone between Oween and the Black Rose of Bromando, how to go about the Second War of the Black Rose, and so on. There were also a lot of clauses on how to ensure that the content of the agreement was followed and implemented. These were all delineated and negotiated with Her Majesty, and there were bound to be disputes and bargaining. Although Brando was not sensitive to politics, he had at least experienced the negotiation between the princess, the northern nobles, and the king's party. He knew these details very well. He entrusted all of this to Delphine. Although he wasn't sure what this woman was thinking at the moment, he didn't have a better choice, did he? Medisha originally wanted to participate in the negotiation as an assistant, but she was rejected by Brando. He did not think that the Silver Elf Princess would be of any use when the Prime Minister's daughter was in charge. Moreover, Wuxia wanted to see her. To be exact, she wanted to see Medisha and Hipamera. Brando originally thought that the high and mighty evil dragon had already left, like the fog of the lost ones. However, he did not expect that after the battle on the ground came to an end, the dragon's figure appeared above the clouds and asked to see his two subordinates. Brando was a little worried, but Medisha pointed out that the reason the dragon wanted to see them might have something to do with their identity as planeswalker creatures. This reminded Brando. He thought about it and realized that this Hepta Dragon Queen was also a planeswalker. She did not see anyone else, only Hipamera and Medisha. She must have noticed their identity. Therefore, after asking the two of them for their opinions, he thought that the evil dragon's identity as a planeswalker should not have any ill intentions towards Medisha and Hipamera. Therefore, he brought them over to the war goddesses in strange armor. After all, the Dragon Queen was already a famous existence during the War of the Holy Saints. If possible, Brando did not want to become enemies with her. After sending off Medisha and Hipamera, Tarkus and Insursta had also left. Phoenix, Fire, Fangchi, Adni and the others were still resting on the battlefield. Brando had no choice but to return to the undead army alone. At this moment, the undead had already disarmed themselves under Delphian's supervision. The undead's method of disarming themselves was very unique. Usually, only the Black Knight, Pale Knight and Lich would symbolically hand over their weapons. Meanwhile, the low-level undead that occupied the majority of the undead army, such as the Crusader executioners and skeleton soldiers, would be dismembered on the spot and turned into piles of bones. As a result, the undead army on the battlefield instantly shrunk by more than 2/3. This was because the undead army brought by the Queen was more elite. Less than 1/10 of the undead army of the Dark Lords were left after disarming themselves. However, Delphian alone could not convince the rest. The low-level undead only knew how to obey and were the best soldiers. However, the intelligent high-level undead were often greedy and unruly. If not for the help of Ekis' daughters, the undead lords would not have willingly handed over their command. Among the ladies that helped, there were naturally a few that Brando was familiar with. However, the first ones that Brando saw in the wolf pack were not the Kohua sisters. The dark Kohua and the kind Kohua seemed to have been avoiding him. During the battle, Brando had seen the two sisters from afar, but once the battle was over, they ran off to who knows where. It was not that he wanted to see them, but he was the most familiar with them among Ekis' 12 daughters. In particular, the kind Kohua had a good relationship with everyone in Valhalla. He wanted to get some information from her. Unfortunately, the heavens did not comply with his wishes. The dark Kohua clearly knew what he was planning and had long since avoided him. The first one that Brando saw was Timmy's. He had met this silver-haired girl once outside the elemental barrier. This was the second time they had met. This time, the latter was not as wild as she was outside the elemental barrier. At least she was wearing a white dress. The bohemian-style dress on her body set off the little she-wolf's extraordinary beauty. She was not wearing shoes. Sitting on the back of a male wolf, she swayed her snow-white feet and greeted him politely. "Good evening, Mr. Brando." Brando was not in the mood to greet this little she-wolf. In theory, he should be grateful to them. If not for the 12 daughters of Ekis leading the wolf pack to appear at the last moment, he might not have been able to defeat the undead army, even if they had ruined his plan in a sense. But the problem was that Brando was very clear about the real reason why the daughters of Ekis took action. From the words of Her Majesty the Queen, the agreement between Ekis and Martha might be real. Although he was not clear about the inside story, Ekis was known as the mother of monsters. With the future of Wond and Erwin in the hands of such a greedy wolf, he found it hard to believe that she would do anything good. She might betray the Twilight Dragon, but would she betray him? In the Pale poem, the Twilight Great Wolves were known for their greed and desire to destroy everything. This tendency could be seen in the 12 daughters of Ekis, let alone the mother of monsters. Would she turn over a new leaf because of an agreement? That was impossible. At least Brando did not believe it. But he looked at Timmy's with some doubts in his heart. Ekis was a real demigod when Wand was projected, and she was much stronger than the god of giants, Milos. As her daughters, Ko-Hua and Timmy's were not too different from her in terms of strength. When he first met Ko-Hua, he could say that she had not recovered her strength, but Timmy's strength seemed to be weaker than her sister's, which was a little strange. In the War of the Last Era she did not die. She only fell into a deep sleep because of Ekis' eternal sleep. But this was destined not to be answered by these cunning little she-wolves. He could only raise his head and ask, "Was it you who was in Port Gassel?" Brando did not forget that someone had ambushed them in the hills outside Port Gassel. At that time, the other party used the same method as Ekis' dream in the Loop of Trade Winds. If he had not seen that dream before, he might have been at a disadvantage. Brando first ruled out Dark Ko-Hua. Although Ko-Hua had a grudge against him, she knew that he had fought with Ekis in the Loop of Trade Winds. It was unlikely that she would use the same method to deal with him. Among the she-wolves he had seen before, only Timmy's was left. "That was not me." Timmy shook her head. "It was Sister Jianghu." "Jianghu, why did she ambush me?" "I don't know about that, Mr. Brendel." No, it's my dear lord. My sisters never tell me what they think." Brando ignored her words and suddenly remembered something. "Isn't Jianghu dead?" Holding her chin, Timmy shook her head like a rattledrum. "Dusk is immortal in the first place. We might die for a while, but as Mother wakes up from her dream, the sisters will wake up one by one." Brando's frown deepened. This was indeed a basic characteristic of Dusk. However, the players originally thought that the giant wolves, as living creatures, might be able to be killed. But now, it seemed that the players who killed Ekis and her 12 daughters in history did not really kill them. Because as long as Dusk was not extinguished, they would wake up one day. This was a real headache. He suddenly turned around as he noticed another figure in the corner of his eye. He turned back to look in that direction and saw a tall woman among the wolves. She was wearing a cloak-like national costume that was very common in the Anzaruta region. She had a slender head resting on her slender neck. She was not as beautiful as Timmy's, but she looked very resolute. Moreover, she had short silver hair and looked more like a boy. When she noticed Brando's gaze, the woman revealed a cold gaze. For some reason, when Brando saw this woman, the name Jianghu subconsciously appeared in his mind. It was because they were too similar. Jianghu was the giant wolf that represented the moon of Evernight. She was Ekis' 7th daughter and the most arrogant one. The arrogant Jianghu once wanted to challenge Ekis' position, but Ekis tolerated her daughter's provocation and instead regarded her as her right-hand woman. She was the most outstanding of Ekis' 12 daughters and also the one with the strongest combat strength. Brando had seen her in her wolf form in his previous life, but he had never seen her in her human form. Chapter 13:20. However, when the other party appeared in front of Brando in such an image, Brando seemed to naturally recognize that this should be Jianghu, the most arrogant she-wolf. "You are Jianghu?" Jianghu looked at him coldly. Her face seemed to be covered with a layer of frost that would never melt. She had no intention of answering Brando's question at all. She only said, "I have something to say to you, human." Meh. Brando was stunned. He did not know this woman before, but he immediately reacted. The other party should represent the will of Ekis. These 12 little she-wolves would not help him for no reason, so there was only one possibility, and that was the mother of wolves behind them. As for why, he could only think that it might be related to White. "What do you want to say?" Brendel calmed down and used the same emotionless tone to ask. "What are you talking about?" Jianghu looked at Timmy's, who stuck out her tongue, jumped off the wolf's back and quickly disappeared into the pack of wolves. Jianghu then stepped aside, and a giant black wolf slowly walked out from behind her. Brando recognized at a glance that it was a son of Fenrir, but this son of Fenrir was somewhat unique. Its eyes did not have the frenzied look of destruction, but were cold and sober silver. Brando only took one look at this wolf and knew who it was, Ekis, the mother of wolves. Speaking of which, other than Milos, who had not recovered from his weakened state, and the Twilight Dragon, who had not been completely unsealed and was confined to the body of a mortal, this was the first time he faced an existence of this level in Wand. That was the will of a demigod. Brando still could not forget the suffocating sense of oppression when he faced the sleeping Ekis in the Loop of Trade Winds. But at this time, when he faced the fully awakened mother of monsters, he did not feel the same sense of oppression. Brando carefully observed the giant wolf for a moment before realizing that the other party had intentionally retracted her pressure. She did not project her avatar into this world, but only used her mind to control the son of Fenrir. Otherwise, no one would be able to stand firm on this battlefield. After all, even he and the evil dragon Queen Fuchsia might not be able to remain calm when facing an existence like Ekis. Upon realizing this, Brando understood that Ekis was unwilling to reveal her whereabouts at this moment. She was obviously secretly projecting herself into this world. He could roughly guess the purpose of the other party's visit. It was obviously related to the 5 sacred swords on his body. The black wolf raised its head and looked at him. "I've seen you once before, human. At that time I felt the aura of the Sword of Earth from you, so I let you go. I didn't expect you to grow to this extent in the blink of an eye." The son of Fenrir spoke. Its voice was that of a mature woman. Compared to Jianghu's cold tone, this voice was rather ordinary, as if it was the voice of an ordinary human woman. But Brando knew that this was not Ekis' original voice. They could actually communicate without relying on the usual sense of sound. The reason why they talked to humans like this was so that they could be understood. When he heard Ekis' words, he could not help but feel goosebumps. Brando of course understood that Ekis was not talking about her dream, but the time when they passed through her demigod's slumber. She was actually awake at that time. "Are you very confused, human?" Ekis did not wait for Brando to speak and answered, "Why did Martha give me the authority of this world?" Brando did not open his mouth. The mother of wolves seemed to have expected his reaction and replied indifferently, "I know you are full of distrust of me. In fact, I don't need your trust. You just need to understand that in fact, whether this world lives or dies has nothing to do with me. I don't particularly want to destroy it, nor do I particularly want to save it. This is the biggest difference between you and me." She paused. "In fact, your Martha and I are the same kind of existence. It's just that she shoulders the responsibility of saving this world, and I don't have this responsibility." Brando was silent for a moment. If it was in the past, he might have already refuted. But after experiencing so many things, calmness and steadiness gradually replaced the impulse in his heart. But this was not because he was cold-blooded, but because the belief in his heart had become firmer. Brando knew that this high and mighty wolf queen would not come to him for no reason. She must have a motive for saying this. Perhaps she wanted to cooperate with him, although it sounded very unreliable. "Then what are you trying to say?" "I'm waiting for you to convince me, human." "Convince you? This world is meaningless to me, but Martha's authority is different. Unfortunately, this authority is not complete for me. Half of it is still with you. Don't you want to give me a reason to save Wond?" Save Wond. This proposition was a bit too big. Brando frowned. Although Miss Tada, White Mist, and Medish's deceitful sister had all said similar things to him, and he himself could feel the majestic power of the 5 holy swords in his body. But in fact, Brando still occasionally felt doubts in his heart. Could he fight against the Twilight Dragon with just the 7 holy swords? So, why did the gods fail again and again? If even he could get the 7 holy swords, how could the gods who created them not be able to do so? Taking a step back, perhaps it was because he was an ancestor. But the problem was that in the early days of Wond's birth, there were also ancestors in the kingdom of God. All these reasons did not hold water. But these doubts did not prevent him from understanding Ekis' meaning. "Your goal is the Amber Sword?" "No. My goal is you." "Me?" "You look a little confused." The son of Fenrir, controlled by Ekis, stuck out its scarlet tongue and licked its lips, revealing a cold gaze. "The holy swords recognize you, not me. Even if I have the authority of Tiamat, I can't do more. I need your help." "Of course you also need my help. What do you mean?" Brando asked with a frown. "It's very simple. But I won't stay in this world for long, so I can't explain it to you one by one. So you just need to understand one thing. Don't you want to save your fiancé, protect your territory, and save the people around you? Isn't this your goal? I can only tell you that everything we do is not contrary to it." Brando took a deep breath. "That sounds good. You're trying to say, but I'm not trustworthy, right?" Ekis shook his head. "It doesn't matter. You don't need to trust me. In fact, I'm here today just to give you a suggestion." "A suggestion?" "Yes, a suggestion, little guy. Perhaps one day you will face a desperate situation. You will find that all your choices will lead you to a dead end. In front of you, there will be a dead end that will make you feel despair. There is no hope, as if all the lights have been extinguished and will never be lit again. If there is such a day, and I'm saying if, do you still remember what the little girl from Madara told you? You have too many things on your shoulders, Marcia's chosen. Your life is too short and you don't understand what fate is, and you don't understand what responsibility is. When that day comes, you will understand everything. Ekis stopped and looked at him with his silver eyes. I hope you can remember what I'm saying now and seriously consider my suggestion. Perhaps you can look back and see another way out. We can protect all the precious things and make this world start anew. Listen carefully, Brando. He called Brando's name for the first time and said softly, You don't want the world to be destroyed because of you, right? Perhaps you can give it a better choice. Brando stared at him. I don't understand what nonsense you're talking about. You will understand. Ekis smiled slightly. The son of Fenrir suddenly convulsed. Black blood gushed out from its eyes, nostrils and ears. After a low howl, it fell heavily to the ground and lost its breath. Brando understood that the damned mother of wolves had left. He raised his head and looked at Jianghu beside him. The arrogant girl only said to him coldly, From this moment on, as the reward you can withdraw in advance from this deal, you will have the loyalty of the wolves. Brando froze for a moment and suddenly reacted, Wait, I never said this deal was established. In his heart, the damned she-wolf was simply here to make trouble. Her strange words reminded him of the tricks used by the evil gods and abominations in The Amber Sword. The gods these cultists believed in were especially good at shaking people's hearts. But unfortunately, these tricks had no effect on him. As for the deal, he didn't believe the other party's nonsense at all. Naturally, it was better to go to hell. But what he didn't expect was that the tall girl didn't care about what he said at all. She just looked at him indifferently and replied, This is my mother's wish. I'm just stating a fact to your excellency. As for whether the deal is established or not, and what your excellency thinks, it has nothing to do with me. That works? Brando was dumbfounded. He wondered if Ekis trusted him that much and wasn't afraid that he would go back on his word. No, to be exact, he would definitely go back on his word because he didn't intend to do as the other party said. Believe that the mother of monsters is trustworthy? Brando felt that he wasn't that stupid. In fact, this was also the reason why he didn't understand why Martha and Ekis would reach an agreement. But now, what puzzled him was that if he had to choose between himself and Ekis, Brando felt that it was more likely to be himself. After all, whether it was the Black Prophecy or the Pale Poem, the Wolf Queen was known for her cunning and greed. As for himself, in the eyes of the senior, he had always been known for his slow thinking. But this obviously couldn't explain the other party's current choice. Brendel thought about it for a long time, but the only conclusion he could come up with was perhaps it had slept for too long, and the mother of monsters had become stupid from sleeping. Chapter 13:21. Medisha felt a shadow approaching her. The wind caused her silver hair to dance like tassels. Although Fuchsia landed on the ground, she was still quite a distance away from them. She landed beside Leviathan's crystallized body and raised her head proudly while folding her wings. Under the moonlight, it looked like a dark mountain. At the top of the mountain, there was a pair of golden eyes staring at them like two bright moons. Greetings, esteemed Lady Fuchsia. Medisha raised her head and looked at the mountain. She would be lying if she said she was not afraid. Fuchsia's fierceness was not in the current era. In fact, not many people had heard of the name of the Seven Dragon King. However, during the era of the War of the Holy Saints, the shadow of this evil Dragon King on the battlefield was a nightmare in the hearts of all her opponents. I haven't heard this name for a long time. Fuchsia replied in surprise. I was fortunate enough to meet you once during the War of the Holy Saints. The Silver Elf Princess replied in a manner that was neither servile nor overbearing. Oh, I should have thought of that. Silver Elf, are you not afraid that I will eat you? Fuchsia lowered her head. Her sharp beak was almost right in front of Medisha's face. Her huge golden eyes were almost taller than Medisha. There was a pair of golden red-eye rings inside, as if they were burning with endless flames. She stared at Medisha, but the latter did not take a single step back. She then looked at Hipamra. The priestess was looking at her curiously, as if she was comparing the difference between this evil Dragon King and her lobsters. Humph, silver elves are still so boring. Fuchsia snorted and raised her head proudly again. She stretched out a claw and on the sharp tip of the claw, a tiny silver card spun. This action attracted the attention of Medisha and Hipamra. As planeswalker creatures they knew very well what that card was. Fuchsia turned around and said, It seems that you have recognized it. What is this? The Card of Fate. Ah, it is indeed called that. But compared to the name itself, the meaning behind it is much deeper. Little one, do you know why it is called that? Fuchsia looked down at the two of them and asked with an arrogant tone. If it was someone else, they might have been angered by such a tone. However, Medisha knew that this was the nature of dragons. These proud lizards would always have a sense of superiority when facing other races. She would not get angry over such a small matter. As for Hippamera, the optimistic girl did not feel that there was anything wrong with Fuchsia's tone at all. Medisa shook her head. What secrets does it hold, Lady Fuchsia? Planeswalker Master did not tell you? Medisha shook her head again. She was very humble because her master was not a real planeswalker. A real planeswalker would need a long period of learning and growth, Tumen's words. Brando, on the other hand, was just taking a crash course. She sighed and said, the legacy of the planeswalkers used to be the most powerful legacy in the world. They were the most powerful and legendary group of people in Vaunt. We are lucky to be the last generation of planeswalkers in this world. Yet, we have to watch it fade away from the history of this world. It's unfortunate that we have to watch it fade away from the history of this world and disappear without a trace. Medisha was touched by Fuchsia's words. She asked, Lady Fuchsia, I have the same question too. I used to think that Odin was the only planeswalker in this world. After he died, the planeswalker's legacy was lost. But later, I realized that the planeswalker's legacy had existed for many eras. Powerful people like you, Lord Tumen, and Lord Kelsey were the ones who maintained its existence. But why did it wither away after 1,000 years? Could it be that in all of Vaunt, only his lordship is the only one who can be recognized by it? You are half right, little one, Fuchsia replied. The planeswalkers are powerful, but the conditions to become one are also very harsh. Plus, the gods are silent, so the power to maintain this network is very weak. In fact, your lord is not the only planeswalker's legacy. His appearance is just an accident. What do you mean? The planeswalkers are a very strict system. You can say that it is simple because its members do not need to study magic skills like the wizards in the mortal world. Incantations and hand gestures are passwords to connect to the magic network. The planeswalkers do not need passwords because they are the masters of the magic network. That is why wizards can only use it, but the planeswalkers can create it. But you can also say that it is very harsh because to become a planeswalker, you must first have authority. What is authority? The elven princess is a bloodline that is innate and cannot be changed. That is why, in the Golden Era, bloodline is everything. The strict hierarchy determines a person's position in life. You are a manager, God's people, a warrior, Golden Race, or a citizen, Silver Race. Insects like the Iron Race are heretics in our eyes, almost no different from magical creatures. Or rather, they are magical creatures that are believed to be created. Just look at those Bronze Generation monsters and you will understand. It has been 1,000 years, but your views have not changed, Lady Fuchsia. Medisha was a little unhappy. The giant dragon with 7 horns slowly shook his head. You're wrong, little princess. I've changed a lot. I don't hate mortals as much as I did in the past. We've failed. I won't reminisce about the past like a nagging old woman. It's just that I'm stating the truth, but you can't accept it. You are saying that the Lord has the bloodline to become a planeswalker, but he is just an ordinary mortal. He is very special. I have said it before. And mortals are very malleable. This is why Lady Martha's plan succeeded. No matter how glorious the Golden Age was, it has failed. No matter how weak the mortals are, they have endless possibilities. They are not bound by the rules of this world, and one day they will become the masters of this world. If you had thought that way back then, Lord Odin might not have died and the war might not have broken out. So many people died because of pride and prejudice. How sad. That's only a possibility, little one. If a mortal wants to reach that step, there are still many things to do. However, the future is full of obstacles, and every step may lead to eternal damnation. It's even wishful thinking. Dusk now has its own will. Do you really think it will let go of the mortal world? The Lord will destroy that will. But what about the Lord himself? To kill the Dusk, he must have the highest authority over Martha. He must take the final step to reach the top of the world, receive the blessings of the gods, and become the master of the laurel crown. But little girl, as long as the order is not destroyed, the Dusk will not be destroyed. This is a dead knot. Medisha remained silent. Fuchsia shook her head. I did not want to talk about this with you. This is a topic that has been going on for thousands of years. The gods have argued about it and there is no conclusion. Those who argued about it have all fallen. What is left is a world full of holes. If those great beings could not save this world, what right do we have to call ourselves saviors? You underestimate yourself, Lady Fuchsia. Medisha frowned. Fuchsia laughed self-deprecatingly. Perhaps. After Odin's death, I am only a paper hanger. I promised Odin to help the Bugas guard the Great Glacier. Now that the seal of the Dusks will has been broken, every war after this may be my last. Well, I have long wanted to see my old comrades. After saying that, the high and mighty evil dragon king let out a sigh. Medisha lowered her head, feeling a little down. She thought of the heroes who fought alongside her in the War of the Holy Saints. How many of them are still alive in this world? As if sensing the emotions of the two, Hippamela worriedly nudged the silver elf princess's arm, as if trying to cheer her up. Thank you, Hippamela. I am fine. Medisha felt the priestess comforting her and turned to smile at her. The priestess also returned a kind smile. Esteemed Lady Fuchsia, Medisha raised her head and asked, "Why have you summoned us here?" She turned around and looked at the mountain range that was glowing under the moonlight. It was actually Leviathan's corpse. The gigantic beast was split into two from the middle like a valley between the two mountains. Of course, it was not Leviathan's true body. It was probably a projection of Leviathan that the crystallizers summoned to this world. But even though it was just a projection, it was still a magnificent sight. The evil dragon did not say a word for a long time. It was as if she could see her own future from the fate of the Leviathan. After a long while, she turned back to look at Medisha and Hippamela. I thought the planeswalker's kindling would rest in eternal darkness with me, but I did not expect Lady Martha to not let this world lose all hope. At least at the last moment she sent you and your master to me. Fuchsia paused for a moment. Medisha, if I remember correctly, that should be your name. And that little girl named Hippamela, don't look around. I am talking about you, Lady Fuchsia? Don't interrupt, little girl. Your power is still too weak. It can't be considered the power of a true planeswalker. However, I can feel from it that your master has already obtained some of the true essence of the power of creation. Perhaps one day he will truly grow, but there isn't much time left for him. There isn't much time left for me either. The evil Dragon King raised its head high and replied in a dignified tone, "That's right. As a senior planeswalker, let me teach you the true way to use the cards of fate." Thousands of miles away, the wrinkles on Tumen's old face crisscrossed. The blood-red pupils in his sunken eye sockets that were modified like agates reflected the pair of siblings in front of him. Dead Moon, huh? Interesting. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.